Chapter 1244. At noon, Yang-yi brought the two kids, who had been playing all morning, to the company to pick up Murphy for lunch. In the car, he told Mo Fei about the performance of the two children in the morning with a smile, and emphasized on praising little Momo, who was getting stronger and stronger. Although Momo didn't dare to play at the beginning, and only knew how to call out to his sister when he was standing at a high place and held his sister's hand tightly, after playing once, he found it fun and dragged his sister up and down to play more than 10 times. Yang-yi laughed and said, "That's right. A real man must learn to overcome his inner fears and face challenges bravely." Little Tianyi was sitting in the back, but he could still understand that his father was praising him. He happily sat in the baby safety seat, moving his butt, rubbing against the seat, and letting out hum laughter. Shishi's big eyes also narrowed into 2 crescent moons and couldn't wait to agree with her father. She reported to her mom, "Yeah, Mom, let me tell you, after that, I wanted to play something else. Then my brother wanted to play the slide." I was speechless. He didn't know where the little girl had learned this online term, but he often heard her use this term recently. When Momo was playing the slide, the static made his hair fluff and explode. I took a picture. You'll know when you take my phone and see. Yang-yi was driving, so it wasn't convenient for him to play with his phone. He smiled and pointed at his phone in the armrest to Murphy. Murphy's reaction was a little slow. She came back to her senses after a while and picked up Yang-yi's phone. She seemed to have something on her mind. However, Yang-yi didn't have to find a chance to ask. When they arrived at the restaurant, he knew what the reason was. They had just sat down and Yang-yi hadn't even started to order, but Murphy couldn't wait to call the two kids. She took out a small box from her bag and said mysteriously, "Shishi, come and sit here. Mom will teach you and your brother a very interesting game, okay?" It turned out that she had been thinking about this memory card, and was anxious to show off her prowess. So she had been silently preparing her opening remarks and explanations along the way. Of course, she was a little indifferent to what Yang-yi was talking about. "There's a game to play?" Shishi was curious and happy. She quickly jumped down from her father's side, and went to the sofa next to her mother. Tong Tong had his own chair, so he didn't have to get down. "Look, this card is a memory card. It has a very cute cartoon on the front, right?" Murphy smiled and showed the front of the card to Shi and Tong. "Wow." She couldn't help but exclaim when she saw the cartoon images. The little girl's eyes were very sharp. She quickly found a card that she recognized. "Hey, this is a little flower fairy. I've seen it on TV before, but it doesn't seem like there's a dumb bear. I can't find it." Cece's interest was piqued. Her little hands were rummaging through the cards, while little Momo was looking at his sister curiously. His little arms couldn't reach these cards, so he could only stretch his neck and stare intently at his sister's search. "I found another little flower fairy, but there's no dumb bear," the little girl muttered. Murphy smiled and explained, "This card has some classic cartoon images printed on it. There are only 17 types and a total of 34 cards. Of course, not all of them can be printed on it." Shishi looked at her mother in surprise. She blinked her big eyes and rubbed the cards with her little hands. She said in confusion, "But the dumb bear is better. The dumb bear is so cute. Why isn't it on the card?" The dumb bear is a new cartoon, so it's not a classic. However, if there are new cards in the future, the dumb bear will probably be included. Yang-yi finished ordering and handed the menu to the waiter. Then he turned around and explained to Murphy with a smile, "Yes, let's play with these cards first. Shishi, you've noticed that these cards are actually 2 copies of the same card. So let's play like this. We'll cover all of them and flip 2 copies. We have to find 2 copies of the same card. If they're not the same, we'll have to cover them back." Murphy explained how to play the memory card. However, perhaps it was because Mo Fei's description was too fast, or perhaps it was because her explanation was too dry, the little ones couldn't really understand. Therefore, when Mo Fei raised her head, looked at the 2 little ones expectantly, and asked them if they knew how to play, Cece shook her head, and little Momo was even more confused. Luckily, Yang-yi helped Murphy out. He reached out and took the cards from Murphy's hand. He smiled and said, "It's okay. I'll play with your mother." We can play and explain to you at the same time. That way, you'll know how to play very quickly. Of course, Yang Yi wasn't sure if Tong Tong could understand. After all, teaching a 2-year-old to play cards was a little difficult. Watching Yang Yi shuffle the cards and place them in the middle of the table, Murphy couldn't help but feel excited. She rubbed her hands together and smiled confidently. Shishi mommy, let's see how good mom is. Mom is super good at this game. Okay. Shishi clapped her little hands happily. Murphy was very satisfied with her reaction. Tong Tong, on the other hand, was very interested in the cards in his father's hand. When a card was dealt, and it was close to him, the little one couldn't help but want to lean out of his chair and touch it. You can't move yet. Murphy quickly held her son down and said sternly like a serious examiner, You can't cheat. Cheat? What the hell? Tong Tong looked at his mother in confusion. Okay, do you want to flip the cards or should I? After Yang Yi laid out the cards, he said to Murphy with a smile, You do it. I'm afraid that I'll win too fast. Murphy said coolly. As she said that, she gave Shishi a smug look, as if to say, You know what I mean. It was as if she was in the same group as Shishi. After all, Shishi had supported her just now. Win too fast. Don't we take turns to flip the cards? Can it be that if we flip the same card, we can continue to flip the cards? Yang Yi asked in surprise. I remember you said that we take turns to flip the cards. When Yang Yi received a threatening look from Murphy, he learned to be obedient. He shut his mouth and flipped 2 cards casually. He really flipped the cards casually, and Yang Yi even tilted his head to one side. This was because Yang Yi, who had learned Qianshu in his previous life, habitually glanced at the cards when they were shuffling. Even if he didn't want to cheat, he subconsciously remembered the position of each card. Murphy looked at the cards that Yang Yi flipped and immediately turned to Shishi happily and said, Hee, look, the 2 cards that Papa flipped are not the same. Yang Yi smiled and explained the game to Shishi and Tong Tong. Mom is right. Mom and I take turns to flip the cards. You see, these 2 cards are not the same, so we have to cover them back. However, you have to try your best to remember what cards are in these 2 positions. In the future, when you remember more cards later, if you encounter the same card, you will know where the other card is and you can flip it back. Shishi looked at her father's hand and face with rapt attention, and listened very seriously. Tong Tong obviously couldn't concentrate. He stretched his little neck and looked at the cards that his father had flipped over. With the colorful cartoon images, the little guy was much more attracted to these cards. Yes, this way we can take back the same cards. It's my turn. Hubby, put your hand back, I'm going to flip the cards. Murphy couldn't wait to play, so she urged him. Speaking of which, Murphy's luck was not bad. The first card that she flipped over was the same as one of the 2 cards that Yang Yi had flipped over. However, Murphy still acted as if she didn't realize it. She reached out and wanted to flip over the other card that had not been flipped over. Fortunately, Yang Yi noticed her silly actions and quickly grabbed her hand. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he pointed at the same card and said, Flip this, did you forget? I flipped over this card just now. Really? Murphy still didn't believe him and looked at Yang Yi suspiciously. Chapter 1245. Yang Yi didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he was being doubted after giving her pointers. He nodded to Murphy helplessly. Murphy opened the card that he was talking about. As expected, the 2 cards became a pair. She immediately picked up the 2 cards happily and put them in front of her, as if she was afraid that others wouldn't give it to her. She happily explained to Shishi, Look, Shishi and Mom have become a pair. We are in the lead. Seeing that Murphy was as happy as a child, Yang Yi couldn't help but smile. He had completely lost the idea of winning the game. While Yang Yi and Murphy were playing cards, the waiter served the dishes one after another. Put it there, wait a minute. Murphy held a stack of cards in her hand, and hurriedly pointed to the empty table next to her. She hadn't played enough yet. Moreover, she still had to play with Shishi and the others later. How could she eat now? Put it there, we will serve the dishes ourselves later. Yang Yi had to stand up and apologetically nodded to the waiter and said, In this round, Murphy's luck was pretty good. and Yang Yi secretly let her win by flipping the cards that he didn't flip, so Murphy won in the end. Shishi, do you understand? Murphy asked as she looked at her daughter after she finished cheering. I understand, but if on this card there are Sister Elsa, Sister Anna, Baby Snow, Ding Dang Manny, a character from the Ice Age, Little Squirrel. The little girl counted and said regretfully, if there are so many that I like, then it would be even better. Yang Yi smiled and said, sure, I'll get someone to get you a deck of cards of our own. Not only that, Yang Yi thought that if the children liked playing this game, he could also get some word cards for Lan Xian to learn, some poetry cards for Shishi to read, or some object cards for Tong Tong to learn more words. However, Mo Fei couldn't wait for the new card now. She enthusiastically asked Cici to play around with her. Cici, you can try it first. Let's see if your luck is as good as Mommy's. Let's play around, and then we will have dinner. Okay then. Shishi didn't mind. She straightened her little chest and pressed her two little arms on the table, blinking her eyes with interest. Tong Tong's attention had long been attracted by the dishes on the table next to him. The little guy looked over there eagerly. He also looked left and right at the decorations in the restaurant, and the waiters in white and black pants walking around with trays of food. It seemed that those dishes were even more interesting. Yang Yi smiled and helped Murphy and Shishi shuffle the cards, then placed them on the table one by one. Of course, Yang Yi didn't cheat last time. When he played games with his family, he wouldn't cheat so shamelessly. Even this time, when he was the referee, Yang Yi deliberately didn't remember the cards, so most of the cards on the table were still unknown. There were exceptions. For example, there were two cards that Yang Yi had just let Tong Tong play with. Tong Tong pinched the edge of the cards, so it wasn't particularly obvious. However, what was Yang Yi's eyes? He only needed a slight glance to know what cards they were. You and Shishi, who's first? Yang Yi asked with a smile. How about a rock-paper-scissors game? Whoever wins will flip the cards first. Okay. Shishi answered crisply. She even actively hid her two little clenched fists behind her back, ready to play rock-paper-scissors with her mother. Murphy, like before, generously let Shishi flip the cards first. These little twists and turns didn't need to be repeated. In the first few rounds, Murphy and Shishi didn't flip the same cards. Shishi was even more unfamiliar with the cards, so she asked her father every time she flipped a card, Papa, look, is mine okay? You have to flip two cards the same to get your own. Yang Yi patiently guided her. Now you can't flip your cards, but you can't hide them. You have to flip them. Everyone has to see what cards you flipped before you can put them back. Okay then. Murphy looked at Yang Yi's bias in guiding her daughter, and she secretly curled her lips. Don't think that Murphy was jealous. This girl played with confidence, and she proudly muttered in her heart. Humph, you let your papa be the military counselor. Do you think you can beat Mom? You're too naive. It was Murphy's turn. Murphy had her own unique skill. She stretched out her hand and stroked the surface of the cards on the table, and her mouth moved. Although she didn't say anything, she said in her heart, pick the soldiers, pick the generals, pick the generals, pick the soldiers, pick the generals, pick the big watermelon Yang Yi. But this time luck seemed to be a little out of touch with Murphy. On the contrary, Shishi's luck was very good. She was the first to flip two cards that were the same. Can I really take them back? Shishi felt a sense of accomplishment. She happily grabbed the two cards, put them in front of her, and looked at her father with a little uncertainty. Of course, put them in front of you. When the game is over, you have to count who won more cards. Yang Yi said with a smile. Murphy looked at Shishi. She didn't care much and calmly prepared to flip the cards, muttering in her heart. It's okay, we can also catch up later. But in the next round, Shishi flipped the same cards again. Moreover, the little girl didn't rely on luck this time. When she flipped the first card, she was stunned for a moment. She hesitantly turned her head to look at her father and asked as usual. Papa, look, I seem to have seen this big monk before. Yes, think about it. Where did you flip it? Find it. Yang Yi looked at Shishi with a smile and encouraged her. There was no doubt about Cici's memory. The little girl blinked her eyes and looked around. She reached out and flipped the card that she had flipped open 2 rounds ago. Yeah, it's really this. Shishi cheered. She happily grabbed the 2 cards and held them in front of her chest with her 2 small hands. The little girl's face was filled with a joyful smile. She pursed her lips and didn't want to laugh, but the corners of her mouth were raised. The baby fat on both sides of her cheeks was arched because of her smile. An intoxicating blush appeared on her delicate skin. Together with the little girl's pink lips, it was as if she had put on rouge, but hers was more natural and shiny. Of course, the most beautiful thing was the little girl's beautiful eyebrows. Her eyebrows were raised when she smiled, and her big eyes narrowed into 2 crescent moons. They were sparkling and very cute. When her father gave her a thumbs up and praised her, she shyly looked away and was secretly happy. But when some people were happy, others were worried. She kept getting the cards, but Murphy's hands were still empty. She couldn't help but feel anxious. "Do you want to ask my husband?" Murphy struggled in her heart, but she didn't want to cheat in front of her daughter, so she had to bite the bullet and continue flipping. In fact, she wasn't very good, because a little girl's concentration was not as good as an adult's. She only remembered the cards that she flipped, and those that her mother flipped, she didn't see them clearly. But in comparison, Murphy's skills were much worse. After 1 round, she took the lead to get 9 pairs of cards and won the game. "No. Let's play another round, okay? Let's play 1 more round. Mom was a little unlucky just now." Murphy looked at the pitiful 3 pairs of cards in her hands in disbelief. Then, she began to grasp the cards on the table tightly, and looked at Shishi with pleading eyes. Tong Tong was drooling as he looked at the delicious food. Shishi, on the other hand, was happy because she won and didn't feel hungry. She nodded at her mother and said confidently, "Okay then. Let's play 1 more round. I think it's quite fun. Don't you want to eat?" Yang Yi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. At first, Yang Yi was worried that Shishi would throw a tantrum because she couldn't afford to lose this kind of card game, but he didn't expect Murphy to start the "let's play 1 more round, okay?" mode. "We'll eat later. Hurry up and help me deal the cards. It'll be very fast." Murphy hurriedly handed the cards in her hands to Yang Yi and urged him. Well, it seemed like he couldn't take her to the casino to play in the future. He couldn't even take her for a walk. Yang Yi secretly made a note in his small notebook, shuffled the cards helplessly, and covered the cards on the table for Murphy and Shishi. But this time, in order to have lunch early and not let the 2 little guys starve, Yang Yi paid attention and memorized the position of each card. Chapter 1246. Before lunch, Murphy finally won the game. Of course, when she won, she was reminded by Yang Yi that she had the last laugh. She felt a little guilty and was too embarrassed to cheer. She hurriedly kept the card and stuffed it into her bag. She giggled and said, "I don't want to play anymore. I don't want to play anymore. Let's eat." Shishi was still a little reluctant. She had lost, but the little girl still wanted to win back. Unfortunately, she could not persuade her mother. She could only accept her father's promise of playing with you again tonight. She picked up her chopsticks reluctantly. They rested at the company in the afternoon. Although it was not as comfortable as at home, Yang Yi and Murphy, as big bosses, still had their own lounge in the company building. The lounge was a little like a hotel room. Usually there would be a professional to clean and tidy it. Moreover, it was a 2-bedroom executive lounge. There were 2 bedrooms and a long and narrow living room. The space was very spacious. It was similar to other people's small apartments. Shishi and Tong Tong, who were used to taking afternoon naps, started to feel sleepy after lunch. Shishi yawned and walked beside her father listlessly, while holding Bao Bun's leash. Tong Tong, who had already fallen asleep, was carried to the bedroom by their father to sleep. Bao Bun, rest in the living room. Shishi, sleep with your brother, Yang Yi instructed. Murphy took out a down quilt from the cabinet and covered the 2 little guys with it. It was winter now, and there was only air conditioning in the lounge. There was no heater. Therefore, when the blanket was just covered, the cool surface of the blanket still made Cece twist and turn, giggling. But soon, the quilt warmed up. Shishi was also sleepy. After yawning twice, the listless little girl closed her eyes and quietly fell asleep under her mother's urging. Murphy returned to the room she and Yang Yi were in. She was still a little persistent. She hugged Yang Yi's arm on the bed and acted like a spoiled child, wanting Yang Yi to teach her how to play the memory card. Hubby, I think you're very good. The cards you pointed out to me are all right. Can you teach me these powerful moves? This way I can play with Shishi at night, Murphy said in a sweet voice. Yang Yi smiled and turned to look at her. Their eyes met. You want to learn from me? This is very difficult. Murphy excitedly nodded her head and said, It's fine. I also have some foundation, so I should be able to learn it quickly. Yang Yi didn't continue to persuade him. Instead, he smiled and asked Murphy to bring the card over. They lifted the quilt and got into position in the middle of the bed. Memory card. Why is it called memory card? Yang Yi fancily shuffled the cards and asked Murphy, Have you ever thought about this question? Murphy looked at Yang Yi's face in confusion and said, Xiaoxian and the others said that these cards are printed with some old animation characters, so they can evoke people's memories. This makes some sense, but in fact the memory card also includes the word memory. Yang Yi covered the cards on the bed one by one and said with a smile, It means that when you turn the cards over, or when others turn the cards over, you have to remember the position and the appearance of the cards that have been turned over. Murphy frowned and asked in confusion, How can I remember? Yang Yi had just finished covering all the cards. He gently raised his eyebrows and waved his hand with a smile, saying, Do you believe that I can remember all the cards here and what each card is? How is that possible? Murphy asked in surprise. Turn over any card to test me and see if I can say it. Yang Yi pursed his lips. Murphy casually grabbed a card on the bed and carefully covered it so that Yang Yi wouldn't see it. She glanced at it and then asked, Then tell me, what is this card? I don't know which animation this card is from, but I know that there is an owl dressed as a detective on it. Yang Yi stretched and said with a smile. Murphy suddenly widened her eyes and looked at Yang Yi in surprise. How did you know? She thought that Yang Yi saw it through the reflection of a mirror, so she deliberately turned around to examine it. She found that there was not even a reflective metal plate behind her, let alone a mirror. I told you, when I shuffled the cards just now, I could remember the position of all the cards. Yang Yi smiled lightly and casually turned the cards over. Look, this is. 10 minutes later. Sleep. I'm not playing anymore. I can't play this game with people like you who have good memories. Murphy put away the cards and yelled at Yang Yi to cover herself with the quilt. Then, she hugged Yang Yi's arm and lay down. After a while, Murphy raised her head and smiled at Yang Yi, beaming with joy and said, However, I still beat Shishi once and you once. As long as we don't play anymore, our chances of winning are still 50-50. She knows how to comfort herself. Yang Yi couldn't help but laugh, but he didn't refute. Instead, he lovingly pinched her nose and said softly, You and Shishi are 50-50, and you still have a perfect record against me. That's already very impressive. Hee, I like it when you let me win. Murphy happily snuggled in Yang Yi's arms. When it started snowing heavily in the north, the weather in Jiang City was pretty good. Although the temperature had dropped a lot, there was no rain or snow. The sky was clear and the air was clear. Looking at the bright sun and blue sky, one would feel comfortable and warm. However, when it came to warmth, it depended on where it was compared to. On Friday night, Zhong Zhenjin, who had flown over from Yangcheng, saw her best friend Chu Fangfang and couldn't help but complain. It's so cold, so cold. You call this cold? I was frozen like a dog in Shanghai. Although it's not far from Jiangcheng, I think it's still warmer there. Chu Fangfang said with a smile. Yangcheng is much more comfortable. At least it's still 10 degrees Celsius, unlike the north. Zhong Zhenjin deliberately played a joke that had recently become popular on microbroadcasting. Chu Fangfang was addicted to learning, so unlike Zhong Zhenjin, she didn't have the leisure to use microbroadcasting. Therefore, she was a little surprised and asked, Jiangcheng and Shanghai are still considered north? Zhong Zhenjin smiled proudly. Of course, there's a saying in Guangdong province that the north of Guangdong province is all north. Chu Fangfang suddenly understood and laughed. You're talking about that? I think I've heard someone say that before. Of course, the two of them didn't come to Jiangcheng just to have fun. On Saturday, they walked around a few famous scenic spots in Jiangcheng. In the evening, they took a taxi to the popular music hall in the coastal area. Because Zhong Zhenjin had done Yang Yi a big favor, they received a reward from Yang Yi: 2 tickets to Murphy's concert in Jiangcheng. Zhong Zhenjin and Chu Fangfang entered the venue with many excited fans, looking forward to it. It was said that in this concert, Mo Fei would release 2 new songs that would only be released in the album next year. Therefore, the tickets for the Jiangcheng station had long been crazily bought and sold. The price of the worst seats was already 4,000 yuan per ticket. After all, under the strict control of Yang Yi's requirements, the scalpers only managed to get very few tickets. On the other hand, Zhong Zhenjin and Chu Fangfang were happier because Yang Yi had given them VIP tickets. They could sit at the front and finally enjoy Murphy's concert up close. Chapter 1247. Because of the advantage of VIP seats, Zhong Zhenjin and Chu Fangfang arrived very early. After checking their tickets and entering the venue, they couldn't wait to go to their seats. Wow, it's so close to the front. Zhong Zhenjin's face was full of excitement as she grabbed Chu Fangfang's arm. Seeing that no one was around, she jumped up and down excitedly. It's really the front row. It's the first row. It's exactly the same as what I checked online. Although Chu Fangfang had always been very calm, at this time, there was a faint expression of surprise on her face. She said with a smile, "Yes, thanks to you. I have the opportunity to enjoy VIP treatment. If I bought this ticket from a scalper, it would probably cost tens of thousands of yuan. Don't talk about money. It's tacky." Zhong Zhenjin waved her hand and said with a smile, "Let's take a selfie. We won't post it on Weibo, it's too high profile. Let's post it on our circle of friends and let those guys envy us." Just as the 2 girls were busy taking selfies, the reporters outside the venue were in an uproar. This was because the deputy mayor in charge of culture and education in the city, as a representative of the leaders, appeared outside the venue. Yang Yi even came out to greet him. This was a bit of a show, but after all, Murphy would be singing a promotional song for Jiangcheng City today, and there would also be a tourism promotional video for Jiangcheng City in the venue. Therefore, it was normal for the city leaders to want to take a look. Not to mention these people, after a quarter of an hour, the venue was already lively. Zhong Zhenjin and Chu Fangfang, who were sitting in the VIP seats and looking at the officials from time to time, were a little nervous. But soon, Zhong Zhenjin found something and excitedly reached out to pat Chu Fangfang's arm. Look, is that Xian Air?" Zhong Zhenjin pointed to a little girl in the middle of a group of people in front of them and whispered to Chu Fangfang, "It should be her." The person holding her hand is her father, Lance Hao Kai, Yang Yi's business partner. Chu Fangfang looked over curiously. Indeed, Lance Hao Kai, Wu Jingjing and Lan Xian were walking out of the corridor outside the stadium to the VIP seats. Yang Yi also went to pick them up. However, Lan Xian was more eye-catching, because she was holding a big bunch of flowers in her hands. To be exact, it was cotton candy in the shape of a flower. They were sold outside the stadium. Every time there was a concert or an event with a lot of people, many vendors would quietly push their carts out. Lan Xian probably saw it too, so she pestered Lance Hao Kai to buy her a bunch. It was quite interesting to eat cotton candy in winter, because the sugar shreds were easier to form after cooling down quickly. They were even more sparkling and translucent. After tearing off a little and biting into it, it was fluffy and delicious, cold and sweet. It was too much of a treat. Lan Xian was so engrossed in eating that she even forgot to walk. If it weren't for Lance Hao Kai holding her wrist, the little fellow would have stopped somewhere and started tearing apart the cotton candy. She would have stayed there to eat forever. So cute. Zhong Zhenjin held her face, which was a little red from the cold, and looked happily at Lan Xian, who was trying hard to eat the cotton candy with her head raised. She said to her companion, "I like Shishi and Xian Air, because Yang Yi often wrote some stories about Xian Air in his micro-broadcasting. She and Shishi are 2 innocent childhood friends." Innocent childhood friends are used to describe a boy and a girl who are childhood sweethearts, right? Chu Fangfang was a very strict academic talent. She was very strict, so she corrected her with a smile. "Tiese." Zhong Zhenjin curled her lips. Lan Kai wanted to help Yang Yi talk with the deputy mayor. When they passed by Zhong Zhenjin and Chu Fangfang's seats and walked to the reserved seats, Zhong Zhenjin couldn't help but ask, Hello. Can we take a photo with Air? I really like her. Zhong Zhenjin was even a little rash. She came up with a red face and asked softly. Lan Kai and the others didn't react. Only Yang Yi noticed when Zhong Zhenjin appeared. However, he didn't notice who the two girls sitting in the VIP seats were because of the backlight. Now that he saw Zhong Zhenjin's appearance, he also reacted. It's you, Yang Yi said with a smile. You and your friends are here, right? Before Zhong Zhenjin could answer, Yang Yi introduced the two girls to Lan Kai. When he heard that they were two enthusiastic fans who helped Yang Yi and Shishi find the Teru Bozu in Yangcheng, Lan Kai let down his guard. He smiled warmly and shook hands with the two girls. Of course, he also politely touched their hands before leaving. Looks like you guys pay a lot of attention to Yang Yi's micro-broadcasting. Otherwise, how could you recognize a girl like me who doesn't have much of a presence? Lan Kai said jokingly. He gently patted Lan Xian's little head. However, Lan Xian didn't realize that she had become the main character. Lan Xian, who was busy dealing with the big marshmallow, finally had the chance to stand still and eat the marshmallow. She even licked the marshmallow that she touched with relish. Her fingers were a little sticky from the melted marshmallow. Since he knew the identities of the two girls, Lan Kai didn't make things difficult for Yang Yi. He generously allowed Lan Xian to take a photo with the two girls. Zhong Zhenjin and Chu Fangfang squatted down and surrounded Lan Xian. They smiled and made a peace sign with their hands. Thanks to Shishi, you're able to enjoy the treatment of a celebrity, Lan Kai said with a smile as he handed the marshmallow to Lan Xian. No, Air is also a celebrity. Zhong Zhenjin had now gone through 6 months of experience in society. She said sweetly, we've seen Air and Shishi perform in school. Air sings very well. She'll definitely become a big star in the future. In this world, because of the developed entertainment industry, being a celebrity was indeed a very important profession. Lan Kai and Wu Jingjing couldn't help but be overjoyed when they heard others praising Lan Xian. Wu Jingjing couldn't help but laugh and say, Really? Air, look, even your sister says that you sing well. You should continue to learn from your mommy Mo in the future. Lan Xian was not interested in what they were talking about. She felt that it was troublesome for these adults to talk to her. They even stopped her from eating the marshmallow. What if it melted later? Oh. Lan Xian tore off a small piece of marshmallow and ate it. She answered absent-mindedly, then turned to look at Lan Kai and asked, Daddy, where is Shishi? Yang Yi answered for Lan Kai, Shishi is backstage. Mommy is also there. Do you want to play with them? Lan Xian nodded. She looked at the marshmallow in her hand, which had lost a lot of weight. She hesitated for a moment and said, Yes, I have to share some marshmallow with them. Well, this piece is for Shishi, and this small piece is for Mommy, because Mommy can't eat so much. She was in a dilemma. She had to give the other half to herself. Although it was not enough, she still had to share some with Shishi and Tong Tong. After all, she had a good relationship with Shishi. Lan Kai laughed and said, Why didn't you say so earlier? Daddy will buy you another one. You even share the marshmallow with Shishi. Are you going to let others eat your saliva? Of course, it was not that Lan Kai had not considered this problem, but he did not want to buy so many because he was worried that if he bought 2, Lan Xian would eat all of them. He did not expect his little foodie daughter to be so generous. No. I tear it off and eat it. I can't eat it with my mouth, because the breath from my mouth will melt the marshmallow. Then it won't taste good. Lan Xian explained methodically. So I can tear it off and give it to Shishi. I haven't eaten this before. Of course, Lan Xian was still taken backstage by Yang Yi to play with Shishi. Lan Kai was busy chatting with the deputy mayor, and this was not a suitable place for a young girl. Chapter 1248. Backstage, the kids were laughing and chatting endlessly. Even though it was just a handful of cotton candy, they still had a lot of fun. Air, look at me. Shishi giggled. Yang Yi turned around just like Lan Xian when he heard that. He saw that she had unknowingly pulled out a large piece of white cotton candy. When they looked over, she gave Lan Xian a look that said, "Look at me," and bit the thick end of the cotton candy. Hee. She chuckled as she bit the cotton candy. Lan Xian and Yang Yi, who had turned around to look at them, could tell what she was doing and laughed. However, she seemed to be worried that Lan Xian couldn't tell. She stroked her beard and said vaguely, "Xian look, doesn't it look like my grandfather's beard?" Yes. Lan Xian had an idea. She also tore off a large piece of pink cotton candy, the inside of the fresh flower, and bit it in her mouth like she. However, she felt that it was very sweet. She couldn't help but lick and eat a little before saying, "Look, mine is red." No, it's not red. Yours is pink. She took off her beard and corrected her with a crooked smile. Lan Xian didn't respond. She was busy stuffing the cotton candy into her mouth with her fingers. Tong Tong was the same. He sat on a chair and held a cotton candy in each hand. He was drooling as he ate. How could he have the time to look at what his sisters were doing? Yang Yi looked at the little guy's childish behavior with a smile on his face, but he felt extra warm. Perhaps he liked this kind of innocent state. He would leave the social work of chatting with the deputy mayor to Lanzhou Kai. Murphy's concert started. Just like before, Murphy opened with Coming Across the Ocean to See You, which was one of her most representative works. There was no need to say much about this song. After all, to a certain extent, it also thanked the fans who came from all over the world to listen to her concert. The familiar melody and slightly sad singing made the fans at the scene intoxicated. However, after the song, Yang Yi came from backstage to the front and stood hand in hand with Murphy. When they saw Yang Yi, the fans below the stage were a little surprised, not only because of the arrow in Yang Yi's hand, but also because in Mo Fei's previous concerts, he usually came out at the end. Why was he so early today? Of course, the fans were very happy to see Yang Yi. After all, when they saw the arrow in Yang Yi's hand, they knew that Yang Yi and Murphy were going to perform a new song. Amidst the applause, Yang Yi smiled and started to talk to the audience. As you all know, Murphy and I have recently signed a contract to become the tourism and cultural promotion ambassadors of Jiangxing City. Although we were not born and raised in Jiangxing City, we have lived here for many years. Our second child was born in Jiangxing City. Therefore, we have deep feelings for Jiangxing City, as if it was our second hometown. Thanks to the people of Jiangxing City, we have become the tourism and cultural promotion ambassadors of Jiangxing City. Since we want to promote our beautiful Jiangxing City to the people of the whole country, I think there is nothing more suitable than a song specially composed for Jiangxing City. After all, Murphy is a professional singer. I can barely be considered a musician. Yang Yi smiled. The fans below the stage laughed. They felt that Yang Yi was too modest. From the number of songs that Yang Yi had written, if he said that he could barely be considered a musician, then who else was qualified to say that they were in the music industry? After Yang Yi gave a simple opening speech, he did not continue to be long-winded. He made an announcement to Mo Fei's next song, then took a few steps back, sat on the era bench that had been prepared for him, and got into a good position. Murphy had been standing quietly beside Yang Yi. Her presence was very low as she smiled and watched Yang Yi speak. Now, after Yang Yi stepped back, everyone focused their attention on her. Murphy, who quietly picked up the microphone, although she did not move much, her temperament was extraordinary. Her movements were natural and elegant. Her every move showed that she could control the whole situation. Perhaps this was the confidence of a Queen of Heaven singer? With the microphone in her hand, the focus naturally fell on her. Only the sound of a bamboo flute could be heard from the backstage. Although it was played by the orchestra behind Yang Yi, the audience could hear the prelude from the speakers from all directions. And very quickly, it was mixed with Yang Yi's era performance and the melody of the ancient Chinese three-string instrument. Such a sad and light prelude made the audience feel refreshed. Music can be played like this? And with so many ancient instruments, this song is not bad. Below the stage, many of the audience had the same thoughts as Chu Fangfang. But after all, the accompaniment was just an accompaniment. It could never overshadow the main character of the song. Especially after the prelude, when Mo Fei's beautiful voice began to sing, people's attention still returned to Mo Fei. There are many stories in Jiangcheng, full of joy and happiness. If you come to Jiangcheng, you will gain a lot. Yes, this Stories of Jiangcheng was a promotional song for Jiangcheng's tourism after Yang Yi had crudely tampered with someone else's Stories of a Small Town. However, although the lyrics were simple and straightforward, and the melody was gentle and long, under Murphy's interpretation, this song still gave off the feeling of peace but full of changes. Listen to her sing. It looks like a painting, but it sounds like a song. The realms of life are true, kind, and beautiful, and this includes. The lyrics were plain and ordinary, but in the dullness, there was a lingering aftertaste. Just by listening to Murphy's gentle and quiet voice with a hint of sweetness, the audience below the stage could describe in their minds the beautiful images of her and Yang Yi in Jiangcheng, like a first love couple, holding hands and playing, or hugging each other warmly. Talk, 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 Stories of Jiangcheng are really good. Invite your friends to come along. Small town is a guest. Although the lyrics returned to small town in the end by singing Jiangcheng, which was not small in size as a small town, it could bring Jiangcheng closer to the audience. Unknowingly, a warm and comfortable atmosphere was created. Although the song was coming from all directions, Mo Fei's singing made it sound like a friend was gently persuading her. Beautiful images that belonged to her appeared in her mind one after another in the song. Perhaps this was just a small town and could not be compared to Beijing, Shanghai, Yangcheng, or Harbor City, but what did it matter? The attitude of life in Jiangcheng was just like the speed of Murphy's singing, slow and comfortable. It was most suitable for a simple life and plain happiness. It would be best if there were a few close friends gathered together in a yard full of flowers, drinking tea and chatting, and telling their own stories. Yes, although it was already winter, listening to Murphy's song made the fans below the stage feel the warmth of Jiangcheng. It was as if spring was coming and the flowers were blooming. Everything was beautiful. Fang Fang, I suddenly want to work in Jiangcheng. Zhong Zhenjin was still so emotional. She held Chu Fangfang's hand and said emotionally, don't talk. Listen to the song quietly." Chu Fangfang raised a finger. She was already intoxicated by Murphy's sweet voice that came from the heart. Murphy sang the lyrics written by Yang Yi, but wasn't she singing her own heart? When the heart was sweet, the voice would naturally be intoxicating. Chapter 1249. After Story of River City was finished, Yang Yi switched to a new guitar amidst the enthusiastic applause of the fans below the stage. He returned to his seat next to Murphy. Clearly, he was preparing to sing another song himself. Could it be another new song? Zhong Zhenjin was very close to Yang Yi. She could even see every string on his guitar. She asked her partner excitedly. Chu Fangfang gave her a meaningful smile and didn't say anything. "I've invited 2 special audience members to my concert today." Yang Yi smiled as he spoke into the microphone that the staff had set up for him. If any of you are paying attention to Shishi Chef's micro-broadcasting, you'll know that I sent a request for help on micro-broadcasting in September. After that, a girl from Yangcheng helped me find a pair of Terra dolls that could only be found on a pedestrian street in Yangcheng. This was reported by the media. Moreover, almost everyone in the audience was a fan of both Yang Yi and Murphy. They all knew about this, so when they heard this, they all laughed. Zhong Zhenjin was stunned for a moment. She pointed at herself excitedly and said to Chu Fangfang, "It's me. Really, this matter has helped us a lot, because this Terabozu is what she wants." I was still thinking about how to repay this enthusiastic fan. Yang Yi briefly explained how he ended up giving Zhong Zhenjin 2 tickets to the concert with the most new songs. However, Yang Yi had a deeper meaning when he mentioned this at the concert. He pointed at Zhong Zhenjin and Chu Fangfang, who were being photographed by the cameraman on the big screen, and said with a smile, "After that, her good friend found me and told me that this kind and enthusiastic girl suffered a huge blow in her relationship last year. She hoped that I would sing, When You're Old, with Murphy to reawaken her beautiful expectations for love." On the big screen, Zhong Zhenjin looked at Chu Fangfang in surprise. She was both shocked and touched. Of course, this scene of 2 good friends being considerate of each other touched many in the audience. Everyone began to applaud. But I think that the song When You're Old is actually a bit of a public display of affection. However, Yang Yi changed the topic and said with a smile, "She's already been emotionally hurt. It's not right for us to show off our love in front of her. So, I've decided that we'll sing for this kind and warm-hearted girl. However, it won't be When You're Old, but a new song tailored for her." Yang Yi ended his nagging and said, "I hope you like The Price of Love, and I hope you can regain your confidence in love. A song written to persuade me?" Although it wasn't written for her to sing, it was enough to make Zhong Zhenjin pleasantly surprised. What could be more ecstatic than your idol writing a song for you? On the big screen, Zhong Zhenjin covered her face and looked excitedly at Yang Yi and Murphy on the stage. Without any other musical accompaniment, Yang Yi directly plucked the guitar strings and gently swept them twice. Then he slowly sang in his slightly weathered voice, "Do you still remember the dream of your youth? Like a flower that will never wither, accompanying me through the wind and rain, watching the impermanence of the world, watching the vicissitudes of life change." Not to mention Zhong Zhenjin, who was currently in a blank state. The other audience members who were listening attentively were all refreshed. Just by listening to the first few sentences, they could feel the sad magic contained in the song. However, this kind of sadness was not hurt, because in Yang Yi's singing, it was like an old man who had experienced all the hardships of time slowly telling his story, leaving a deep aftertaste. "The price I paid for love is something I will never forget. All the sincere and infatuated words will forever be in my heart, although he is no longer there." Yang Yi's singing was very special. When he said the last word he said it heavily and then gently let it go. It sounded like a short sigh. The audience who had never been in love might not have a deep understanding of the lyrics, but when Zhong Zhenjin or other fans who had fallen out of love heard it, they couldn't help but think of the person who had once been in love sweetly. Yes, perhaps this person had long been pushed out of their hearts, but all the beauty, those vows of undying love, those sincere and infatuated words, were still vivid in their minds. However, Yang Yi's song wasn't to make them reminisce and indulge in the memories of the past, because Yang Yi paused and began to raise his voice and sing softly, "Go, go, people have to learn to grow up by themselves. Go, 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 life will inevitably experience pain and struggle." Yes, the essence of this song was in the persuasion at the end. With a series of go singing, Zhong Zhenjin, who was in a daze, couldn't help but come back to her senses. She opened her mouth slightly and looked at Yang Yi. Yang Yi didn't like to sing like the current pop singers who pinched their throats and pretentiously sang. His singing style was a bit like the original author, elderly. It was as if he was pressuring his own life experience with the vicissitudes of life like an old father gently enlightening a confused child. But the more it was like this, the more flavorful this song was. When Yang Yi was singing, Murphy really didn't have any sense of presence. She stood quietly to the side as if she had become one with the lights. As long as the fans weren't watching her, everyone would think that Murphy was just standing on the stage and listening to Yang Yi sing. Since that was the case, why did she stay on the stage? But this was indeed the case for this song. When Yang Yi and Murphy practiced, they didn't intend to make it into a duet. It was only after Yang Yi finished singing the first verse that Murphy quietly raised the microphone. In the second section, Yang Yi played the guitar accompaniment, and Mo Fei's voice sounded leisurely. "Maybe I still miss him occasionally. Sometimes I can't help but miss him. Just treat him as an old friend. He also makes my heart ache, and also makes me miss him." Murphy's voice was still very different from Yang Yi's. Yang Yi's voice was full of vicissitudes while Murphy's was much gentler. But this didn't mean that Murphy would sing this song in the same sweet voice as when she sang Jiangqing stories. Her style changed with the content of the song. In this song, Murphy's interpretation was a bit like Liang Yongqi's. There was no deliberate sweetness, no deliberate vicissitudes of life, and no other deliberate fluctuations of emotions. She sang as if she was at her age, an intellectual woman in her 30s with experience, clear and tranquil. Of course, Murphy's strength lay in her ability to wrap her emotions in her calm voice. The changes in rhythm and emotions were actually very rich, but this required the audience to listen carefully and feel with their hearts. But this was the charm of the live scene. Zhong Junjun and Chu Fangfang could feel Murphy's excellence in singing up close. Chu Fangfang was just happy and sighing, but Zhong Junjun was directly stirred up by the deep emotions expressed in Murphy's voice. When Yang Yi sang, she was still in a daze. When Murphy shouted, Zhong Junjun was already in tears. That's right, that bastard. Why would she still think of him from time to time, and even occasionally worry about his recent situation? It shouldn't be like this. It's just that there's no longer a spark in my heart. Let the past go with the wind. All the sincere and infatuated words are still in my heart, although he's no longer there. Murphy's voice was like the wind, reaching Zhong Junjun's ears. She blurred her eyes and tried hard to look at the stage. It was still a string of let's go, let's go. Zhong Junjun suddenly realized that her mood was better again. In fact, it was just a small piece of suppressed emotion. In her heart, he was indeed no longer there, wasn't he? I've also been sad and cried, and my heart has also been broken. This is the price of love. Yang Yi and Murphy were still singing on the stage. Love was indeed like this. There was beauty, but there was also a price. But now that she thought about it carefully, it was actually nothing. Let's go, let's go. Find a home for your heart. Zhong Junjun saw that on the stage, Yang Yi and Murphy were singing while looking at her encouragingly. Her heart suddenly felt at ease. After all, scumbags were only a small part of the population. She still had to bravely face the price and bravely find her own beautiful love. Just like Yang Yi and Murphy, she had to properly manage a warm and happy family. Chapter 1250. Although it was just a concert, the day after Mo Fei's concert, many media outlets still used a large number of sections to report on Yang Yi and Mo Fei. After all, in this concert, Yang Yi and Murphy came up with new songs, and not just one or two. In addition to the 2 new songs in Murphy's new album that were promised at the beginning, Yang Yi also sang The Price of Love for enthusiastic fans. These were all very hot news material, and the entertainment media naturally wouldn't miss it. Of course, there were also many professional music media reports on Murphy's concert from another angle. They used the evaluation of a magician who plays with melody and words to express their praise for Yang Yi. In addition to the praise for Stories of Jiangcheng and The Price of Love, the media also gave another new song, The Thief of Time, a very high evaluation. Even if it's like a dream, half awake, laughing and crying is happy. Good lyrics are like a pot of mellow and fragrant old wine. Listening to Murphy's soft narration of The Thief of Time, there is such a feeling. The wine doesn't intoxicate the person who intoxicates himself. As long as you taste it carefully, there will always be a long and graceful aftertaste. Those who have been in love before might be able to understand the feeling of being half awake, half crying, and half laughing. Time is the same. In the illusion of love, time will gradually pass by your fingertips. When you come back to your senses, perhaps you will already be in tears. For example, time is something that catches people off guard. When it's sunny, there's wind. And when it's cloudy, sometimes it's raining. Can't compete with day and night. Thinking of the past, I stole the hair but kept you. This paragraph is not only catchy, but also meaningful like a poem. The structure of its words and sentences is also very wonderful. When it's sunny, there's wind, and when it's cloudy, sometimes it's raining. This sentence is not a simple symmetry of the 2 groups of words. When it's sunny does not match with when it's cloudy. Instead, the word when is dropped to the back. Although it's not a parallel symmetry, when sung, there is a kind of interlocking charm, which is very worthy of people's careful consideration. A lot of reports and reviews made many fans who couldn't get the tickets start to feel anxious. Although there were some behind-the-scenes videos of the concert that were officially posted on the internet, after all, they weren't clear sound sources, and they weren't complete songs. They couldn't wait to hear the 3 songs praised so much by the music critics. However, although the voices for Murphy's new album were louder, Yang Yi and Murphy were still not in a hurry. They didn't change the idea of releasing the new album after the Spring Festival. After the concert, Yang Yi and Murphy stopped their work and began to prepare for the upcoming winter holiday trip to Sweden. Traveling abroad was nothing special for Yang Yi's family. After all, they had set foot on the other two continents before. But this time, it was a little different, because this trip to Sweden was in winter. Whether it was the children or Murphy, who were used to living in the mild climate of Jiangxing, they had never seen a world of ice and snow. What's more, Sweden was a Nordic country that was much higher in latitude than the northeast of China. In winter, it was covered with ice and snow, and the average temperature was a few degrees below zero. Such extreme weather was definitely not a small challenge for them. So Yang Yi started to buy some cold-proof equipment for the trip to Sweden early. When Shishi found out about this, she was suddenly interested. Every morning when she woke up and went home from school at night, she ran to look at the calendar and counted with her fingers how many days were left before the holiday. Not only that, the little girl was also eager to participate in her father's travel plans. Although she didn't know how to browse a lot of foreign websites and make travel guides like her father, she had a friend who could consult her. After learning piano in the evening, Shishi went to find Lu Weisha for a video chat. She told Lu Weisha about the progress of her father's preparations, and how many days were left before she could visit Lu Weisha. Lu Weisha also looked forward to Shishi coming over to play. She was even happier than Shishi. She had been looking for some of her own knowledge to tell Shishi what was fun in her hometown. So, the following scene often played out in Yang Yi's study. Papa Papa. Shishi, wearing her cute cartoon pajamas and a hoodie, ran over and knocked on the door of her father's study. She waved the phone in her hand excitedly and said, Lu Weisha said that we can stay in their house, but we can also stay in a hotel made of super beautiful ice. Look, Lu Weisha sent me a photo. It's all snow and ice here. Isn't it super beautiful? It's a bit like Sister Elsa's house. The little girl was not satisfied with standing on the ground and talking to her father. This way, her father could not see the photo. She twisted her little butt and squeezed into the gap between her father's big boss chair and the table. Then she sat in her father's arms. This way, she could let her father hold her and then free her two small hands. One hand held the phone, the other swiped the phone screen and pointed at the photo on it for her father to see. Ice Hotel, of course Yang Yi knew about it. He smiled and used the mouse to click on the travel guide document that he was making on the computer, and showed a few photos to Shishi. Are you talking about this? Dad also found it. The whole hotel is made of ice, and there are many beautiful ice sculptures in the rooms. Do you want to experience such a hotel? It's just that it's a bit cold living here. It's not like our house where there's a heater. When the time comes, we still have to wear thick clothes to sleep. Yang Yi laughed. Wow, this is even more beautiful than the one Lu Weisha showed me. Shishi turned her head and looked at her father in surprise. The little girl was addicted to the magical ice and snow magic. She felt that these beautiful ice and snow hotels must have been built by a very powerful magician, just like how only a powerful person like Sister Elsa could build them. How could she listen to her father's criticisms? It should be the same hotel that Lu Weisha told me about. It's just that it's different every year. This is also a photo from last year. Every winter, it will collect new ice to build the hotel. Maybe when we go to see it, it will be even more beautiful. Yang Yi laughed happily. And in this hotel, we can also live in an igloo with a glass dome. If we're lucky, we can see the aurora. Wow. The little girl listened to her father's description. Her little hands couldn't help but clasp in front of her body. Her two big eyes revealed a pious light of yearning. She whispered in admiration. I like it so much. Then let's book a hotel room like this and stay there for one night. Let's try it, okay? But at that time, don't say that you're afraid of the cold. Yang Yi said with a smile. Okay, but why is it only for one night? I want to stay in such a beautiful hotel every day. She couldn't help but move her little butt, open her hands, and said excitedly. Yang Yi laughed and said, That won't do, where is it too cold? It will freeze you, little brother and mom. Woo, I'm not afraid of the cold. She pouted her little mouth and acted coquettishly with her father. Papa, if mom is afraid of the cold, let's let mom and little brother stay in Lu Weisha's house. Then Papa and I will stay in such a beautiful hotel, okay? She left her mother and little brother behind just like that? Shishi, if your mother knew, she would spank your little butt. Yang Yi smiled. He knew that no matter what he said, she wouldn't know how terrible the cold was. Therefore, he just rubbed the little girl's head and said with a smile, "Let's wait for you to stay there for one night and experience it. If you're not afraid of the cold, then we'll talk about it." I'm sure I can. I'm not afraid of the cold. I'm like Sister Elsa, I can use magic." The little girl jumped down from her father's arms and said happily. With that, she ran out again. Although she was wearing thick pajamas, the little girl's figure was still very light. She couldn't wait to tell this good news to Lu Weisha. Chapter 1251. It was suitable to eat mutton in winter, because mutton was warm in nature. It nourished the liver and brightened the eyes. In cold weather, eating mutton would make one feel warm all over. Therefore, this weekend, Yang specially bought a whole leg of mutton and some mutton chops. He was going to cook a mutton-themed feast to reward Shishi and Lan Xian, who had been studying hard and preparing for the final exams. However, Lan Xian was a little unhappy today. She wandered into the kitchen. Although she usually came to see what delicious food her father was cooking, the little girl was obviously not in a good mood today. She pouted her little mouth, afraid that her father would not see her. When Yang Yi saw this, he asked with a smile, "What's wrong? Xian, don't you like mutton?" "No." Lan Xian quickly shook her head and pouted her little mouth as she said, "I like mutton. I like it very much." At this time, Yang Yi also guessed the problem, so he asked, "Then why are you unhappy? Is it because your parents don't want you to go to Sweden with us, so you're unhappy?" Hearing what her father said, Lan Xian felt even more wronged. She grabbed the edge of the table with her two little hands, pouted her little mouth, and nodded unhappily. In fact, Lan Haokai and Wu Jingjing were quite assured that Lan Xian would go abroad with Yang Yi and the rest. After all, Yang Yi would be watching over them. However, this winter break was different. Before the spring festival this year, Wu Jingjing had to go back to her hometown in the northeast. After that, she had to go back to her hometown in the countryside of Jiangqing for the spring festival. During the entire winter break, their schedule was full. Of course, Lan Xian had to go with them. Therefore, Lan Xian could not go to Sweden with Shishi to play with Lu Weisha. However, how could a child consider the difficulties of their parents? After Lan Xian's request was rejected by her mother, she threw a tantrum for a few days, crying and refusing to talk to her mother. This was also one of the reasons why Yang Yi called Lan Xian over for dinner. He was entrusted by Wu Jingjing to help enlighten Lan Xian, who was still sulking. As Yang Yi cut the mutton, he said gently to Lan Xian, who was watching from the side, "Actually, it's Papa Yang's fault that you can't go to Sweden this time." Lan Xian raised her head in surprise and looked at the side of Father Yang's face. Yang Yi turned around and smiled at her. "I didn't know that your mother had made plans for the holidays. If I had told your parents earlier, we might have been able to go to Sweden together. But because I didn't think it through, Cici only told you about this matter now. As a result, your mother has already promised your grandparents that she will go back to her hometown to take a look, so you can't play with us." Lan Xian stomped her feet anxiously. Her thin eyebrows drooped as she said unhappily, But I don't want to go back to the northeast. Because I want to go to Sweden with Shishi." Lu Weisha said that her hometown has a lot of delicious food. There's delicious fish, a lot of delicious cakes and cheese to eat. Yes, although your grandparents' home also has a lot of delicious food, it can't be compared to Lu Weisha's home. There are so many delicious food that you haven't seen before. It's all Papa Yang's fault that you can't go with us. If you want to be angry with Papa Yang, okay? Yang Yi smiled. Be angry with Papa Yang? Lan Xian's expression was obviously hesitant. She frowned and muttered, "I know. It's just, Papa Yang, can you tell my father that I don't have to go back to the northeast with my mother and can go with you?" The little girl's logic was still very clear. She knew what to do to satisfy her wishes. That might not be possible. Because think about it, your grandparents haven't seen you for so long. They must miss you very much. They have prepared a lot of delicious food at home for their precious granddaughter to come back, Yang Yi said with a smile. If you don't go back, how disappointed will they be? Don't you think so? Think about it. They have prepared so many delicious food. What kind of delicious food is there in the Northeast? Dumplings, those thin-skinned dumplings with a lot of meat. They are very delicious. Candied sweet potatoes, this is not bad. This is a sweet potato that has been boiled with sugar and fried. When you pick it up, there will be very, very sweet sugar shreds pulled out. Perhaps it was because Yang Yi talked about a topic that Lan Xian was interested in. Although the little girl was still pouting, she finally couldn't help but say, also, that double-fried pork is also very delicious. It's full of meat inside. There are also sauce bones. They are very big. I can't finish eating one because there is still meat inside the bones. Yes, they have prepared so many delicious food for you to go back to eat. If you don't go back, will they be very sad? Yang Yi continued to guide her. Just like today we made mutton. There was the rosemary fried mutton chop that we ate in foreign restaurants, stewed mutton bone soup, curry mutton, braised mutton, and finally, there was handheld mutton rice. If Papa Yang prepared all these delicious dishes, and then you said that I was going to play and wouldn't be eating at our house, would Papa Yang be very sad after I meticulously prepared so many delicious dishes for you? When Lan Xian heard this, her round eyes widened. She even seemed to smell the fragrance of the handheld mutton rice. She couldn't help but lick her mouth and cry out in protest. No, why wouldn't I eat at Papa Yang's house? There is so much delicious food. Then you should go back to Grandpa and Grandma's house, because they also prepared delicious food for you very carefully. They love you so much, don't you think so? Yang Yi asked. Lan Xian scratched her little butt with her hands and looked hesitant. It's okay, Yang Yi said with a smile. His voice was slightly emotional. It's just one less trip to Sweden. The next time we go, we will definitely take you with us. Also, Xian, let me tell you this time, I have a very mysterious mission. Lan Xian's attention was attracted by Papa Yang's mysterious rambling. She couldn't help but ask curiously, mysterious mission? Yes. I want to secretly learn how to cook the best food in Sweden, like those cakes, fish, and so on. Yang Yi couldn't help but smile. When I come back, I can make it for you and Shishi to eat together. Really? Lan Xian looked at Yang Yi in surprise. Of course. Think about it. Papa Yang is so good at cooking. When Papa Yang comes back after secretly learning how to cook, how can he not make it for you to try? Yang Yi raised his eyebrows proudly at Lan Xian. Hee. That's true. Lan Xian's mood finally improved. With a look of anticipation, she stuck out her little belly and laughed. So it's settled then? You don't have to go to Sweden with us. Be good and follow your mother and father to the Northeast. Play with your grandparents, and then you can eat good food. When we come back, Papa Yang will cook the best food in Sweden for you. Okay. Yang Yi struck while the iron was hot and asked. Lan Xian struggled for a while, but in the end, she nodded gently and said with a little worry. Then Papa Yang, you must learn how to cook the best food. Of course. You must learn well. Okay, Papa Yang will do it. How can you be worried? Finally, Lan Xian turned back to play with Shishi and Tong Tong satisfied. However, when the little girl went out, she couldn't help but turn back and ask, Papa Yang, when can we eat? I really want to eat mutton rice. Chapter 1252. When Lan Xian ran back, Shishi raised her head and looked at her expectantly. She asked, Xian, did my papa ask you to play with us? It turned out that the two girls had already discussed it. However, Shishi was disappointed because Lan Xian was not sad at all. Instead, she giggled and said proudly, I'm not going to Lu Weisha's house. I'm going back to my grandparents' house. Your father said that he would learn how to cook delicious food for me. But then you can't play with us. Shishi was stunned for a moment and said sadly, Lu Weisha's house has beautiful snow and a hotel that has been magically transformed. We have snow at home too. Lan Xian said, Shishi, I've shown you before. My grandpa's house also has beautiful snow. Shishi blinked. Now that Lan Xian had mentioned it, she finally remembered. However, she didn't know how to convince her friend. But I really want to go to Sweden with you. Then we can play with Lu Weisha together. Shishi pouted unhappily. If you don't go, I'll be alone. Tong Tong, who was next to her, was speechless. Of course, Shishi could not change the fact that Lan Xian could not go. After being sad for a while, the two girls simply stopped thinking about it. Little Momo saw that his two sisters were unhappy and didn't want to play with him. He blinked his big eyes and squatted at the side to think for a while. Suddenly, his eyes lit up and his little mouth broke into a happy smile. Sister, here, help me get it. Little Momo pulled on two of Cece's fingers, wanting to pull her sister up from the ground. However, the little fellow was too weak. Her little face was red from holding her breath, and she couldn't even pull her sister up. Little brother, what are you going to take? Cece stood up from the carpet in confusion, and followed behind little Momo as she asked. Little Momo giggled as he walked in front, but he didn't say anything. When they reached his pile of toys, the little guy turned his head. His little mouth was slightly open as he pointed to the building blocks under a basket of model cars. Do you want to play with a fire engine? Shishi helped Tong Tong move the model cars down, but she misunderstood. The little girl squatted down, picked up a big fire engine, shook it, and asked Tong Tong. No, it's not a fire engine. Tong Tong's pronunciation was better now. He pouted and waved his hands. Seeing that his sister helped him move the heavy basket, Tong Tong was excited. He bent down shakily and grabbed the edge of the basket with his two little hands. He groaned and tried to pull the basket of building blocks. Of course, the basket that Yang Yi used to pack up little Tao Wu's toys actually had wheels. Even though it was heavy, little Tao Wu was still able to drag it by himself. It was just that the way he was stuck up with his little but stuck up, with no way out, was a little comical. Little brother, let me help you. Shishi saw this and quickly went up to help Tong Tong move the basket out. Cece was still very strong. She grabbed the two sides of the basket, which looked as heavy as a mountain to little Momo, and lifted it up with a light lift. This made little Momo very envious. When can I be as powerful as my sister? But soon, little Fuan shook his head and tossed the thought to the back of his mind. He looked at his sister, then turned back to look at the toy fire engine that his sister had taken out and put aside. He tilted his little head and pondered for a moment, then picked it up and followed his sister out eagerly. It was time to play with building blocks. Little Momo sat on the carpet and used his two little hands to pull out all the building blocks from the basket. When there was still a little left, the little guy used all his strength to lift up the basket. With a crash, the remaining building blocks fell all over his body. These building blocks were all made of wood. They were neither light nor heavy, but the craftsmanship was excellent. Every edge of the building blocks was polished smooth, unlike those low-quality building blocks that had a bumpy feel. Moreover, because they were painted, the building blocks had many different colors. When they were put together, the building blocks were colorful and looked like a work of art. Tong Tong was now putting the building blocks on the basket. Watching him play, Lan Xian and Shishi, who were bored, couldn't help but come over. Mommy, are you playing with building a house? Lan Xian asked as she picked up two triangular building blocks. When Tong Tong saw that Lan Xian was also holding building blocks, he thought that she was going to play with him. He happily pointed at the top of the building blocks he put up and waved his little hands. Here, put it here. We can also build a house. Xian, I remember that we built a small house when we were in kindergarten. The teacher gave us super big building blocks. Shishi said excitedly as she gestured with her hands and feet. Super big building blocks? Tong Tong looked at his sister in surprise, as if he had heard something incredible. However, not everyone had a good memory like Shishi. When Lan Xian heard Shishi's words, she looked at Shishi in confusion and asked, Really? Yes, and you said that your papa builds houses. Xian, let's build a house too, okay? My little brother has a lot of building blocks. It's just a little small. Shishi giggled and suggested. Okay. Therefore, the two sisters started playing in front of Tong Tong. When Tong Tong played with building blocks, he simply put the building blocks he picked up and put them on the basket. He didn't even think about the shape of the building blocks. However, it was much more interesting for his sisters to play with building blocks. First, they used square building blocks as the base, then long building blocks as the pillars and the door frame. They even put triangular building blocks on top of the building blocks. That way, the shape of the building looked much better, and it looked more like a proper building. Of course, Shishi and Lan Xian were not very creative, and the building blocks they built were not very beautiful. The two girls were still novices, but they were much better than Tong Tong, who played carelessly. Tong Tong couldn't help but look at the building blocks his sisters built, and then compare them with his own. He even forgot to continue building his own building blocks. After scratching his head, Tong Tong simply watched his sisters play. What is this? Shishi was quite satisfied, and she asked Lan Xian with a giggle. This is the entrance of a zoo. Lan Xian was also very imaginative, and she gestured and said, there are many animals behind here. We have to go in and take a look from here. Tong Tong stared blankly at his sisters with his mouth wide open. He was a little unable to follow his sister Lan Xian's train of thought. Shishi's imagination was stimulated by Lan Xian. She excitedly grabbed Tong Tong's fire truck and shouted. The fire truck went around Tong Tong's tower-like building, and then drove to the building blocks they built. That's right. When my younger brother becomes a firefighter uncle in the future, we can take my younger brother's fire truck together. From our home here, we can come here to play and see the zoo. Cece began to tell the story excitedly. It seemed a little wrong. How could they drive a public fire truck to play? However, how could a child understand these things? Children's words carried no harm. Tong Tong realized that he was also in his sister's story. Moreover, his sister's story was easy to understand, and he quickly became enraptured by it. Lan Xian also excitedly added, I know. We were playing in the zoo, and then we smelled something. Mommy said that there was a fire, and she wanted to drive the truck to put out the fire. Woo. Tong Tong felt that he had been given an important task, so he excitedly grabbed the fire truck from his sister's hands. He shouted happily, but his movements were a little clumsy. He drove the fire truck and knocked down his tower-like building. Hee, little brother, if this happens, we won't have a place to stay at home, Shishi said. Hurry up and put out the fire. And what's that smell? Lan Xian exclaimed as she sniffed the air with her little nose. It felt as if her acting had become real. However, she quickly looked towards the kitchen in surprise. Wow, I know, it's the smell of mutton. Papa Yang is roasting mutton. It smells so good. Chapter 1253. Finally, in Shishi's eagerness, the final exam was over. The next day, the little girl was going to board the plane to the Nordic countries with her parents and brother. Before leaving, Shishi didn't forget to send Bao Bao, Xiaoguai, Dodo, and the two chickens to Lan Xian's house with her father and asked Lan Xian to help take care of them. Although Lan Xian would soon return to her grandmother's house in the northeast, her house had a nanny to take care of it. Grandma Wu would stay in Jiangqing to take care of the pets and flowers at home. Xian remember to give Bao Bao, Xiaoguai, and the others food every day. That way, they won't miss us too much and lose weight, the little girl said to Lan Xian reluctantly. In fact, taking care of pets was not Lan Xian's responsibility, but Shishi and Lan Xian didn't know that. Lan Xian listened to Shishi's request and still felt that it was a little difficult. She scratched her head and looked at the large wave of pets with a troubled expression. One had to know that their house only had one pet. In fact, there was also a large group of ornamental fish in the fish tank. Usually Lan Xian didn't need to take care of them. Now that so many pets had suddenly appeared, it seemed a little troublesome. Moreover, they were making a fuss. The three fat cats were fine. They had lived in Lan Xian's house several times, so they didn't feel strange at all. However, the two chickens were restlessly moving around in the cage. One of the roosters even crowed from time to time, and its voice was even louder than Lan Xian's own. Bao Bao was the most noisy one. He knew that his owner was going to leave him alone again, so he was whining sadly. He even shook his head to match the sound of his voice. She didn't know which husky he had learned from, but he seemed to be sadly saying, I don't want to live anymore, I don't want to live anymore. Bao Bao, you have to listen to Xian. Papa and I will come back to take you home soon. She felt pity for Bao Bao. She squatted down, held Bao Bao's head, and comforted him. Shishi, you should also tell Xin Air that she will help you get the student handbook and see how many marks you got on the final exam. Then she will tell you on WeChat. Yang Yi said to Shishi with a smile. That's right. Shishi called out in a clear voice as she hugged the steamed stuffed bun. The two girls still had a lot to talk about. Not only did Shishi have something to tell Lan Xin, but when Shishi was about to leave with her parents, Lan Xin also came over and hugged Shishi's arm reluctantly, whispering in her ear. Hee, I have a camera with me. Shishi said to Lan Xin with a smile. Lan Xin said, and said anxiously, then you must remember it. Yang Yi took the children from Jiang City to Shanghai first. At present, there were 3 cities in China that had open direct flights to the capital of Sweden: Beijing, Shanghai, and Harbor City. The history of Shanghai's flight was not long, but it was the closest to Yang Yi and the others. While waiting for the plane in the VIP lounge of Shanghai International Airport, Murphy looked at Shishi. The little girl was sitting on the sofa and humming a song. Her long legs extended over the edge of the sofa and were shaking gently, exuding her happy mood. Murphy suddenly thought of something and asked, Hey Shishi, did you bring your winter vacation homework? There was no other meaning to this question. It was a typical, Mom saw that you were idle and was a little unhappy, so she wanted you to study. Shishi came back to her senses. She blinked and looked at her mother innocently. After a while, she shook her head and replied, No. Why didn't you bring your winter vacation homework? Mom, I remember that you have already sent your winter vacation homework. Murphy frowned and asked doubtfully, We are going to Sweden this time. If you bring your winter vacation homework with you, you can do it during your break, such as now. What if you can't finish your winter vacation homework by the end of the vacation? Shishi felt that she was being questioned by her mother. She pouted her little mouth and unhappily twisted her little butt on the sofa. She said, Papa said that I didn't need to bring it. Yang Yi had just gone to the front desk to see if there was anything to eat, and asked the waiter to bring it over. As soon as he sat down, he heard the conversation between the two and asked curiously. When he figured out why Murphy made Shishi unhappy, Yang Yi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He patted the back of Murphy's hand on her lap and said softly, Well, don't blame Shishi for this. It was my decision. Seeing Murphy's puzzled eyes, Yang Yi said with a smile, It's okay. Since we are going on a trip, let's have fun for a few days. Shishi also promised me that when we come back from Sweden, she will seriously make up for the homework. Murphy was a typical traditional Chinese parent. She said to Yang Yi with some worry, I'm worried that Shishi will play outside and will only think about playing when she comes back. She won't be able to sit down and study. Then we have to cultivate the child's self-control. She should play to her heart's content, and study to her heart's content. This way, she won't delay each other. Yang Yi said with a smile, Instead of thinking about studying during the trip and being absent-minded when doing homework, why don't she be like us now? We have agreed that she will study hard when she comes back. Don't you think so? Shishi. Cece pouted her little mouth and nodded her little head. Yes. Come on, pinky swear with Mommy so that Mommy won't worry. Yang Yi smiled and raised his eyebrows at the little girl. Shishi was amused by her father's raised eyebrows. A smile appeared on her face, and she regained her enthusiasm. She jumped down from the sofa, stretched out her right pinky, and ran to her mother. Murphy wasn't stubborn. She believed in Yang Yi's teaching methods. She shook her head gently and smiled. She pinky swear with Shishi and said gently, Well, Mommy will watch your performance. Yang Yi and his family were sitting in the first-class cabin. Moreover, the first-class cabin of an international flight was very luxurious. Each seat had its own cubicle, and when the door was closed, it was their own personal space. For the children, the happiest thing was that each seat had its own independent TV to watch. They just had to wear headphones. Tong Tong, who had been on planes many times, was very calm. Although he was only 2 years old and was still a little kid, he wasn't like the little girl sitting in the business class in the VIP passage. She was very scared when she was in a confined space, and cried loudly in her mother's arms. The little guy had been staring at the crying little girl. This made Murphy very worried. She was afraid that the crying would be contagious. Fortunately, Tong Tong didn't seem to care at all. He just looked at the little girl curiously. When they arrived at their seats, Tong Tong was placed on the chair near the window by his mother. The adults were all busy putting away their carry-on luggage and didn't have time to pay attention to Tong Tong. However, the little guy was still laughing. He stood up on the soft sofa and held onto the partition next to the chair. He watched his sister and parents busy walking around. This posture made it seem as if he was watching everyone work, but in fact, he was also actively participating in it. "Papa, do I sleep with my brother?" Shishi was a little excited when she got on the plane. She first skipped around the first-class cabin and then ran back. She pointed at her brother and asked her father, "Do you want to sleep with your brother?" Yang Yi smiled and said, "But you have to sleep in the middle. That way, it's more convenient for your mother or father to take care of you." Tong Tong was listening next to them. He obviously misunderstood. He grabbed onto the partition and jumped up from the sofa. He shouted anxiously, "Oh no, I want to sleep with my sister." Yang Yi reached out and pinched Tong Tong's nose. He said with a smile, "Who said no? Why are you in such a hurry?" Tong Tong was a little confused. He looked at his father in a daze. He seemed to be thinking, "What do you mean?" "Then my brother and I will move here." Shishi actively picked up her brother's pillow. "Brother, come down. Let's sleep in the middle. There's one in your seat too." Chapter 1254. After a long flight, Yang Yi's plane arrived at the capital of Sweden. Before they got off the plane, they could see the thick snow piled up outside the runway through the window of the plane. The terminal not far away was also covered with white robes. Needless to say, before they got off the plane, Yang Yi and Murphy dressed the two children in many layers of clothes and thick down jackets. They also put on warm knitted hats on their heads. Finally, they tied a circle of scarves that could be pulled up at any time to protect the children's delicate faces from the wind and frost. Murphy also wore a lot of clothes. However, women like to look beautiful, so she didn't wear bulky cotton pants. Instead, she chose a combination of flannel leggings and jeans, which made her legs look longer and thinner. A long windbreaker and snow boots could also keep her legs warm. In addition, she also wore a thick shawl. Although it wasn't made of animal fur, it was still very warm. After all, she had made enough preparations, so Murphy's dressing was still very fashionable. Yang Yi didn't wear so much. He wasn't afraid of the cold, so a down jacket was enough for him. But even so, Yang Yi's dressing was not considered shocking in such a cold Nordic country. After they got off the plane, they saw some blonde Westerners in the terminal. They didn't know if they were locals or tourists. Anyway, they were all Westerners with blonde hair and blue eyes. Not all of them were fully dressed. Although the airport had heating, after all, except for the staff, many people got off the plane or came in from outside to take the plane. Some of them were even wearing thin sports jackets and a pair of shorts that exposed their long calves. They were traveling with backpacks. There were also some beautiful Nordic women who were sitting in coffee shops and drinking coffee while waiting for the plane. They were elegantly wearing skirts, and only a windbreaker was draped over the back of the chair. Such attire made Murphy envious. Of course, everyone's physique was different. There were Westerners who wore cool clothes, and there were also Westerners who were afraid of the cold and wore thicker clothes. For example, there was a middle-aged man in sunglasses who was sitting in a chair and chatting with his friends. Although he was tall and strong, he still wore a sweater that was obviously added with velvet and held a windbreaker in his arms. David and his family, who had come to pick up Yang Yi and the others, were also wearing a lot of clothes. Their physiques were still very normal. Of course, when they met, no one paid attention to the issue of clothes. After not seeing each other for half a year, other than Shishi and Lu Weisha who were happily holding hands and jumping around together, David and Yang Yi, and Maria and Murphy were also happily hugging each other. And what about Tong Tong? That's alright, this little guy is very discerning. Originally, he was sitting in the luggage cart that his father was pushing. When he saw his sister and sister Lu Weisha hugging each other, he hurriedly rushed over and hugged each sister's thigh with one hand. "Shishi, your brother still remembers me," Lu Weisha said happily to Shishi. "Yes. I told him that we were going to look for Sister Lu Weisha to play, and then he knew it was you. She was overjoyed. She held Lu Weisha's hand and couldn't bear to let go. The two girls were communicating in Swedish. At this time, David looked over and said gently, Lu Weisha, you have to speak English with Shishi because Shishi's mother doesn't understand Swedish. Lu Weisha stuck out her tongue embarrassedly. She and Shishi moved to the side so that the adults wouldn't see them and secretly whispered to each other. They were probably condemning her strict father. From time to time, happy laughter could be heard from Lu Weisha and Shishi's side. However, even though Lu Weisha was chatting with Shishi in English, Tong Tong still couldn't understand. He tilted his head and looked at his sisters in confusion. He didn't know what they were talking about. However, this was normal. Tong Tong was used to not understanding the words of the adults. Lu Weisha's home wasn't in Stockholm. Usually, because of David's work, they would live in an apartment in Göteborg. Lu Weisha would also go to school in Göteborg. However, their hometown was actually in Luleå, a beautiful and quiet town in the north. In fact, compared to big cities like Stockholm and Göteborg, Luleå had a lot less cultural sites to visit. Moreover, it was winter, and the sunshine was very short. Instead of going to Luleå, it was better to stay in Stockholm or Göteborg. The two cities were closer to each other. However, because Yang Yi's family came from afar and wanted to experience the local customs of Sweden, as well as enjoy the beautiful natural scenery and aurora of the Arctic Circle, Luleå and its neighboring northernmost city, Kiruna, were the best choices. Therefore, according to Yang Yi and David's previous discussion, while David was on his annual leave and Lu Weisha was still enjoying her last week of winter vacation, they arranged for everyone to gather in Luleå and Kiruna. After that, Yang Yi's family and David's family would return to Göteborg. With Maria as their tour guide, she would take them to other cities in Sweden. In Yang Yi's plan, besides Sweden, they had other itineraries. After that, after Yang Yi and his family said goodbye to David's family, they would take the world's famous train that ran through Europe from Stockholm to Paris. By taking the train, they could enjoy the scenery from Northern Europe to Western Europe. And it also saved them a lot of trouble. Of course, when they arrived in Paris, it was Murphy's shopping time. After buying clothes and bags, they finished their trip to Europe and took a flight back to China from Paris. There was a lot of talk about the travel plan, but no matter what, under David's arrangement, they would first take a bus to the train station, then transfer to the train to Luleå. Sweden was not a very big country. Its land area was not as big as China's Sichuan province, but the shape of its land was long and narrow. From Stockholm to Luleå, there was still a distance that was close to Hong Kong and Shanghai. However, although the journey was a little rough, Shishi and Tong Tong, who had slept enough on the plane, were still very excited, especially Shishi. She sat next to Lu Weisha on the train. The two girls looked at the scenery outside the window and chatted happily. It's a pity that you didn't come to our house to play on Christmas Day. Lu Weisha brought up the issue again. She said regretfully, otherwise we would have a lot of delicious food and programs. I even held candles and sang poems with my grandma in the church. But I have exams and it's my holiday now. Shishi said regretfully. Okay then. Hey Lu Weisha, is your watch broken? I saw the time on the watch. It's only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Why is the sky already dark? Shishi asked curiously. It's not like that. It's very dark in winter here. Lu Weisha said to Shishi with a smile. Then my teacher said something. Oh, I forgot the principal. Look, it's so dark outside. In our school, classes are still open at 4 o'clock, so the day after tomorrow is still bright. Shishi opened her hands and gestured. I know, because I also studied in China, and I was your classmate. Lu Weisha giggled. Tong Tong did not understand at all. He could only look at his sister and then at the blonde Lu Weisha. His eyes were full of admiration. Perhaps the children were full of vigor, so they were not only not afraid of the cold, but also had a lot of fun. However, Murphy was not so optimistic. After coming out of the terminal, she was blown by the cold wind. She was so cold that she could not speak. Although she was fully prepared, Murphy still underestimated the power of winter in the extremely cold region. She sadly found that the clothes she was wearing seemed to be a little too little. Her windbreaker and shawl could not withstand the cold wind. The cold wind was like a slippery mouse, going straight into the gaps of the clothes. When the snowflakes hit her face, Mo Fei felt that she was going to be suffocated by the cold. Fortunately, Yang Yi noticed her predicament. Not only did he take off his down jacket and put it on Murphy, but Yang Yi also hugged Murphy in his warm embrace in the unheated taxi. "You're wearing so little. Aren't you cold?" Murphy looked at Yang Yi, who was only wearing a long-sleeved shirt in the cold wind. She was dumbfounded. After calming down in the taxi, she could not help but ask Yang Yi. "Of course, your husband is trained after all." Yang Yi raised his eyebrows at Murphy proudly and said. Murphy had heard Yang Yi say this many times. In the past, she thought that Yang Yi was just bragging. This time, she really believed him. Fortunately, the train was heated. This time, Murphy learned her lesson. She asked Yang Yi to keep watch outside the toilet on the train. Then, she changed out of her jeans and put on down pants that could really withstand the cold. In addition, Murphy took out her thickest down jacket from the luggage and prepared to put it on when she got off the train. When they came out of the toilet, Murphy blushed and covered Yang Yi's eyes. She said embarrassedly, "Oh, turn your head. Don't look." "Why? You're not ugly," Yang Yi said with a smile. "I'm very ugly, okay? I'm wearing so much that I'm bloated," Murphy shouted. "How is that possible? You're already very thin. No matter how much you wear, you won't feel fat. Moreover, such a beautiful woman is standing here. I tell you, even if there are 100 more clothes to cover you, no one will think you're ugly," Yang Yi shouted. Although she knew that Yang Yi was making her happy, Murphy couldn't help but giggle. She retracted her hand and said, "How can it be as exaggerated as you say? Okay, I'll let you look. Isn't it ugly?" Yang Yi deliberately looked at Murphy, then laughed and hugged her. He said, No, I have to hide you. Such a beautiful wife can't be seen by others." Hee, old Yang, touch your conscience and see if it's still there. Chapter 1255. Putting aside the cold and snow, Lul was a quiet and beautiful historical town. When the train arrived at Lul, David drove them through the city shrouded in darkness. Everyone could see that there were almost no other cars passing by, and the city was mostly filled with low-rise private houses. There were no high-rise buildings that made people feel busy. Under the night sky, tens of thousands of houses were brightly lit. It should have been a different kind of scenery. However, it was a pity that the city was too small. It was so small that it could only be called a small town in China. Its population was also small. The residential areas were sparse, and there were some trees in between. It was the same for David's house. It was a two-story house, a combination of brick and wood. Because the surface was covered with a layer of snow, it did not seem to have any artistic achievements. However, after entering the house, it was a completely different world. The combination of the wooden floor and the wooden stairs, in addition to the animal skin blanket that was tightly laid out, looked extra simple and warm under the illumination of the bright lights. David's parents were at home. They had prepared a sumptuous dinner for the guests. The hungry children couldn't wait, and urged the adults who were still chatting to sit at the table. Perhaps they were really too hungry. After the meal started, Xixi and Lu Weisha, the two little girls, gathered together and looked at each other while laughing and eating heartily. It was worth mentioning that Lu Weisha used a knife and fork at home. However, for Xixi, who occasionally went to eat Western food with her parents, using a knife and fork was not unfamiliar to her. It was just that she wasn't used to it, especially when it came to cutting large pieces of chicken steak. The little girl was a little embarrassed and wanted to ask her father for help. "Xixi, let me help you." Lu Weisha didn't wait for Yang Yi's response. She stood up very enthusiastically and reached out to take the knife and fork in Xixi's hand. She helped Xixi cut the chicken steak on the plate into small pieces. "This is much better." Xixi happily smiled at Lu Weisha. Tong Tong, on the other hand, could not help himself. He still did not know how to eat these things. Western dinners were like this. A large plate was placed in front of him. There were two pieces of bread with different shapes, tastes, and textures. There were also some corn kernels, mushrooms, a large piece of chicken, and of course delicious Swedish meatballs. However, Tong Tong couldn't handle these knives and forks, so with her mother's help, she tried them one by one. The adults also drank some wine and chatted happily. Tong Tong could only drink pea soup, but Murphy did not know that the Swedish pea soup had been spiced with mustard. The little fellow tasted a mouthful, and her little face immediately wrinkled. It took a while for her to recover. Don't. Tong Tong put on a bitter face and waved her hands repeatedly. Her fearful expression amused the two elders. However, the other dishes were still quite delicious. Let's not talk about the meatballs. When Lu Weisha came to China last summer, they had eaten them before. Tong Tong's favorite dessert was the berry cake that everyone served in advance for him. The jam was made from wild berries, and it was smeared directly on top of the delicately baked cake. The sweet and sour jam immediately whetted little mommy's appetite. After eating one cake, she still wasn't satisfied. She even pulled her mother's hand, wanting to eat a second one. However, perhaps because she was too happy eating, she forgot one thing. When she was almost full, the little girl suddenly cried out in annoyance. She put down her fork and patted her head lightly. She pouted her little mouth and said to her father, "Oh, I forgot." Lu Weisha could not understand what she said earlier, so she asked curiously, "Shishi, what did you say? What did you forget?" Yang Yi asked Shishi in English. "I forgot to take pictures," the little girl explained. "There's so much delicious food that I forgot to take my camera out. I need to take pictures." It felt like a compliment in disguise. Hearing this, Lu Weisha's grandmother was very happy. She stood up and used a pair of tongs to pick up some fresh and tender salmon for Sisi, saying, "Eat more if you like." "Oh, there's still so much? I can't finish it all." Shishi looked at her plate and touched her little belly. She was a little embarrassed. "Shishi, you should thank your grandmother," Yang Yi reminded her. After Shishi thanked her grandmother obediently, Lu Weisha could not help but ask, "Shishi, why did you take pictures?" It's because of Xian Air." The little girl crossed her two little hands in front of her and smiled at Lu Weisha. She was a little embarrassed. She said that she wanted me to take pictures of all the delicious food that I ate, because when my papa comes home, he will cook delicious food for her. Yang Yi was stunned for a moment when he heard this. Then he realized with a smile that when the two little girls hugged each other and whispered to each other when they parted. "Why didn't Xian Air come to our house to play? I miss her too," Lu Weisha said regretfully. The two little girls might have been full, so their fighting spirit dropped sharply and they began to chat. Yang Yi and the others stayed at Lu Weisha's house for one more day. Near the Arctic Circle, the sunshine time in January was actually very short. The next day, when the sky brightened, it was after 10:30 in the morning, and before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun went down again. So, taking advantage of these few hours of bright sunshine, David took Yang Yi and his family to visit some of the old buildings in Lowell. The most important thing was that this was the famous church village, and there was even a stone church with a long history that could be traced back to the 15th century. Of course, the most beautiful thing was the wooden houses with red walls and red tiles near the church village. The wooden houses that were only 1 story high formed a continuous line. The red paint on the walls contrasted with the white snow, giving off a unique feeling of grandeur. However, it was said that in the summer, there would be a grassland on the ground here. "We will hold a midsummer festival celebration here in the summer," David introduced. Lu Weisha also said happily to Shishi, "My mother will participate every time, and sometimes I will participate too. We will wear red clothes and white dresses, and then we will hold a wreath and dance. It's so lively." Shishi looked at Lu Weisha enviously. She didn't know that the scale of the celebrations in these small cities couldn't be compared to the temple performances during the spring festival in Jiangcheng. She just listened to Lu Weisha's description and added a rich and lively scene in her mind. A sea of people, red clothes and white dresses. Wow, that's amazing. The little girl's praise made Lu Weisha even more excited to share. Lu Weisha wasn't even this lively in China. Now that Shishi was in her hometown, she became more willing to talk and kept telling Shishi about some special things in her hometown. Of course, They only stayed in Lul for 2 days. Soon, David's family and Yang Yi's family boarded the train to Kiruna. There, the little ones could not only stay in the ice-themed hotel that they had been looking forward to for a long time, but they could also ski and experience some small adventures that they had never imagined. Chapter 1256. Hee. Behind a skiing-themed hotel in Kiruna, there was a smooth and clean snowy slope. It was only around 9 in the morning, and the sky had just started to brighten. At the bottom of the slope, a group of people were panting lightly as they lined up and started to climb up slowly. In fact, it could not be considered a mountain climb, because its altitude was pitifully low. If it was skiing, it would be equivalent to 2 ski slopes that were only about 100 meters long. Moreover, the mountain was not steep, and there was a buffer between the 2 sections to slow down the speed of the descent. The only difficulty was that the snow wasn't very thick. It would still make it difficult to walk as easily as it was on flat ground. Even though it was a big challenge for the children, Shishi bravely followed her father's footsteps and tried her best to climb to the top of the snowy mountain. That's right. Yang Yi and the others had woken up early in the morning and had been waiting for the sun to rise. At David's suggestion, they decided to climb up the small snowy slope together and enjoy the beautiful sunrise. At the beginning, when they said that they would compete to see who was the fastest to climb up the slope, the 3 children were very enthusiastic. Lu Weisha and Shishi, the 2 long-legged sisters, took big strides and walked in front of them. Tong Tong, who was tightly wrapped in a scarf, did not want to be outdone. His short legs left shallow footprints as he ran forward to catch up with his sisters. However, when the slope was very flat at the beginning, the 2 sisters giggled and ran far away. When Tong Tong, who was trying to balance himself like a little penguin, looked up and glanced at them, he was surprised to find that his sisters had already run more than 10 meters, leaving him far behind. Oh, no. Tong Tong was stunned on the spot. His muffled muttering could be heard from the scarf covering his face and mouth. The little boy stood there stupidly and stretched out his gloved left hand, as if his sisters were in front of him, and he wanted them to hold his hand as they walked. However, a gust of cold wind blew past. The little boy only felt the wind passing through his fingertips, but his sisters were walking further and further away. Tong Tong took back his hand and scratched his head with some effort. Strictly speaking, he was scratching his thick woolen hat. He mumbled something and continued to walk forward, chasing after his sisters. After passing through the short, almost flat slope, they finally started to climb the slope. Although it was not steep, there was a slight angle, and the soles of their feet were a little slippery. The 2 girls, who were full of energy, could not run too fast. Lu Weisha was panting slightly. She held Shi's hand and told Shishi to walk slowly with her experience. Okay, let's walk slowly. We still have to wait for Papa and Mom. Cece's stamina was very good. She wasn't even out of breath yet. She nodded energetically at Lu Weisha, and then leaned over to speak. The 2 girls walked in front of them hand in hand. They were both wearing pink ski jackets and were about the same height, just like a pair of twin sisters. However, this part of the challenge was much more difficult for Little Rascal. The little boy, who was still very strong even after being abandoned by his sisters, suddenly slipped and fell on his knees on the snowy slope. In fact, Yang Yi, Murphy, David, and Maria were all following behind Tong Tong. David and Maria were used to seeing Northern European children walking on snowy city roads. They also knew some Eskimo children who followed their hunter parents through snowy mountains and dense forests to hunt at a young age. However, when they saw a Chinese child who had lived in a warm southern city since childhood showing good perseverance, they were all praising Tong Tong to Yang Yi. Murphy was still very worried, but Yang Yi comforted her and insisted that Tong Tong also go through some training. However, just as they were praising the little boy, he fell down. Mo Fei was taken aback. In a panic, she wanted to pull him up, but she almost fell down herself. Yang Yi reacted the fastest. While pulling Mo Fei, he strode forward and gently grabbed the little guy's arm with his other hand to prevent him from losing his balance and rolling down the mountain. However, what surprised Yang Yi was that the little boy did not seem to care about his fall at all. Perhaps it was because the snow was soft and did not hurt when he fell, but Tong Tong only frowned after his father pulled him up. He lowered his head and looked at the snow on his gloves and the snow on his pants when he knelt on the snow. It was a little dirty. It was okay. Tong Tong skillfully wiped his hands on his body. Soon his gloves were clean. Are you hurt? Murphy squatted down and pulled down the scarf on her face. She looked at her son and asked worriedly. Tong Tong shook his head. There was even a hint of a smile in his eyes. Murphy realized that after pulling down the scarf, her face was cold and looked a little like Mom's. She quickly pulled it up and asked in a muffled voice, "Let Dad carry you, okay?" However, Tong Tong seemed to have found a way to speak comfortably from his mother's actions. He pulled down the scarf and revealed his red lips. He pointed at his sister and said, "I want big sister." Yang Yi did not know whether to laugh or cry as he shook his head. In order not to delay everyone's journey, and considering that they still had to play later, he did not want to let Tong Tong exhaust himself. He simply carried Tong Tong in his arms and rubbed his head against his son. He laughed and said, "You only know how to ask for big sister. Can't you ask for Mom and Dad? Okay, Dad will take you to chase after big sister now." Murphy stood up. She did not forget to tug at Yang Yi and ask Yang Yi to wait while she redid the scarf for Tong Tong. It was freezing cold. Murphy did not want Tong Tong's mouth to be chapped by the cold when they returned home. When the group of people climbed up the snow slope, the sun finally began to show signs of rising in the sky. The cloudless blue sky of Kiruna seemed to be dyed with a layer of light at the edges. Gradually, the purple light spread out and dyed the snow-white mountain slopes and the snow-capped mountain peaks in an intoxicating purple. Wow! Murphy, who had climbed up with great difficulty and was so tired that she could only hug Yang Yi's arm and stand there. At this moment, she was also stunned by the beautiful scenery in front of her. She sighed softly in admiration. Although Yang Yi took out his camera and asked David to take pictures of their family during the sunrise, they did not forget to appreciate the beautiful scenery. When the sun rose from the horizon at around 10 o'clock, its golden rays bathed everyone. Shishi raised her head happily and happened to see her father's gentle gaze. The little girl smiled happily and leaned her small body on her father's body. "It's so beautiful. Dad, take a picture of it. This way, I can take the picture and tell it to Xine Air, little Yuer, big sister Xiaowei, Qiqi, Shiyun and Zhaoyu." When her father took the picture, Shishi was still very excited and pointed to the left and the right. "Then you have to learn how to ski. This way, you will have more stories to tell them," Yang Yi said with a smile. Lu Weisha, who was next to Shishi, heard this and excitedly jumped in front of her and said, "Shishi, I'll take you to ski. It's very easy. Although I'm not very good, skiing is really fun." Chapter 1257. Although they had climbed to the highest peak, if they wanted to ski, they still had to go back the way they came and return to the foot of the mountain. After all, Shishi and Murphy were still a pair of novices. It was easy to go up the mountain, but difficult to go down. Even if it was a small slope, it was still difficult to ski in the snow. When Murphy went down the mountain, she was a little unsteady on her feet. However, as she hugged Yang Yi's arm, she was unconvinced by Yang Yi's evaluation and asked, "Why aren't you a novice? Have you ever skied before?" Yang Yi smiled proudly and said to Murphy, "Your husband is awesome. Except for not going to outer space, there is almost nothing on Earth that your husband can't do." Murphy thought that Yang Yi was bragging, so she snorted and made a face at Yang Yi. However, with the scarf covering her face, he could only see it through her eyes. The two of them were flirting in private, and only Tong Tong, who was in Yang Yi's arms, could hear them. However, the little guy did not notice. His red nose was frozen, and his bright eyes were looking at his sisters who were falling in front of him. Shishi and Lu Weisha slipped from time to time, but they did not care. They did not even need the help of their fathers. They helped each other up and then giggled with each other. The two girls did not use scarves to cover their mouths. Shishi also pulled down her scarf. The energetic little girl did not seem to be afraid of the cold. Her cheeks were as red as Lu Weisha's from the cold, but this did not affect their light laughter in the sun and snow. "Hey Lu Weisha," Shishi, look here, look what I found. David suddenly shouted not far ahead. What is it? Lu Weisha muttered curiously. She then called out to Cici, and the two young ladies ran over excitedly. Tong Tong was envious when he heard his sister's exclamations, but he had no intention of leaving his father's comfortable embrace. Tong Tong knew that she could not walk as fast as her long-legged father. If she followed her father, she could get closer to her sisters faster. Why not? Soon, Tong Tong also saw something that made her sisters gasp in amazement. It was a small sleigh that had been left here by an unknown person. It was made of wood, and some snow fell on it, making it inconspicuous. We have to send it back to the below. Lu Weisha repeated her father's words to Yang Yi, but she got stuck on some words. Lost and found. She remembered it clearly. Although she didn't know the meaning of the unfamiliar word, it didn't stop her from reading it out for Lu Weisha. That's right. Lu Weisha scratched her head in embarrassment. But before that, David chuckled. He pulled up the skateboard of the sleigh and said to Lu Weisha and Shishi, "You can sit on this first." Lu Weisha and Shishi cheered excitedly one after another. Lu Weisha thought that it was fun to sit on the sleigh, but Shishi didn't know anything. When she saw how excited Lu Weisha was, she also cheered and jumped. Even though Cici was wearing thick winter clothes, she could still jump around a little. Tong Tong, on the other hand, couldn't do it. The little guy was weighed down by the clothes, and he was so clumsy that he had to sway when he walked. But it didn't matter. Tong Tong relied on his weak and helpless advantage to enjoy the treatment of an emperor. After a flurry of arrangements, Lu Weisha sat at the front, Shishi sat at the back, and Tong Tong was sandwiched between his two sisters. Murphy was a little worried and told Shishi to hold on to her little brother and not let go. "Mom," Tong Tong groaned. His eyes sparkled with excitement, and his little hand pushed his mother's hand away. Murphy was stunned for a moment. She was so angry that her nose became crooked. She muttered sourly in her heart, "Little guy, you've forgotten about your mother now that you have your older sisters?" The pulling rope of the sleigh was handed over to Yang Yi, who volunteered himself. His strength was undeniably great. After 2 days in Sweden, David had already been convinced by his strength. Yang Yi not only pulled the sleigh, but he also held Murphy's hand with his other hand. He still looked relaxed. Under Yang Yi's control, the sleigh slowly descended. The little ones sat on the sleigh and screamed. Although the speed was similar to walking, it was still a little exciting. They had their backs to their fathers, but their bodies were tilted downward. Looking at themselves sliding down, they felt as if they were going to suddenly fall. However, did he think that this would scare the little ones? She couldn't help but shout excitedly, "Papa, faster! Faster!" It seemed to be a little slow. It would take a long time for them to go down the mountain. Lu Weisha was in a state of excitement. Although she spoke in Chinese, Lu Weisha could basically understand. She followed Shishi and shouted a little tongue-tied, "Faster!" Tong Tong's ears were filled with the sound of the wind and the various screams of his sisters. He didn't understand what they were shouting about. However, at this time, Tong Tong couldn't care less about what his sisters were shouting about. He was infected by his sisters' emotions. He also waved his little hands and shouted through the scarf, "It's weird, it's bad." Yang Yi smiled helplessly and said, "We can't go any faster. If we go any faster, we'll fall." The little ones didn't care. Instead, they laughed and had a lot of fun. The one who was about to fall was Murphy. However, when she saw the children's happy expressions, she couldn't help but get close to Yang Yi's ear and whisper, "I also want to play with this sleigh." Yang Yi looked at her in surprise. Although he didn't say anything, Murphy could tell what Yang Yi meant. "Do you want to snatch it from the children?" This incredulous expression made Murphy gnash her teeth in hatred. She habitually reached out to Yang Yi's waist, but this time there was no way. There was a thick layer of clothes between them. "I was joking," Murphy said resentfully. However, it was obvious that she was a little depressed. There was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Okay, after teaching the children how to ski, I'll take you to play something else. It's more interesting and exciting." Yang Yi smiled and coaxed her softly. When they returned to the bottom of the hill, everyone changed into the ski equipment they bought yesterday. Tong Tong was more pitiful. He couldn't ski yet, so he could only watch his sisters run in and out. They were instructed by their fathers to put on helmets, gloves, and other protective equipment. They also wore ski goggles. Then each of them hugged their skis excitedly and waved them in front of Tong Tong. So cool. Tong Tong looked at Shishi with envy and admiration. No one knew what was going on in his little head. Tao Wu, come here. Finally, as if his father had finally remembered him, Tong Tong saw his father waving at him. Although Tong Tong was a little clumsy from being wrapped up, he still ran over happily. However, his father just tidied up his clothes and pointed at Maria. Tao Wu, you have to follow this auntie later, okay? Daddy will come back later to take you on the sleigh. Chapter 1258. They started skiing. Tong Tong did not follow Maria, but followed behind Murphy, who was so upset that her nose was about to become crooked. She even wanted her mother to hold her hand. It turned out that Tong Tong had made a fuss just now. Murphy had no choice but to sacrifice her entertainment time and stay behind to take care of Tong Tong. Luckily, Maria also stayed behind to accompany her, so the two of them were not too bored. Leaving Tong Tong and Murphy aside, Yang Yi and David brought the two girls and ski equipment to the slope. First, there was a demonstration. David was born and raised in a snowy country. Even if he had put on weight in his middle age, his skiing skills would not be too bad. It was worth mentioning that Lu Weisha was only 8 years old, which was 1 year older than Shishi. In China, she was still at an age where she needed to be protected by her parents and was doted on by her grandparents. However, Lu Weisha had also been skiing since elementary school and had fallen countless times. Lu Weisha, who was wearing a light purple ski suit, was like a purple butterfly as she slowly slid down the slope. Of course, Lu Weisha did not know any fancy tricks. She was more careful when she was standing up. Then, she gently made a small turn and slowly slid in front of Shishi. Wow. Lu Weisha, you're so good. Shishi was wearing ski goggles. Perhaps she was not used to it. She raised her head slightly and looked at Lu Weisha enviously. You know how to ski? Lu Weisha shook her head and said honestly, I'm not good at skiing because I haven't learned to ski often. My brothers are better than me. Lu Weisha was not being modest. She had not learned to ski for a long time, so she could not compare to the children in her hometown. Before Shishi started skiing, David and Yang Yi started talking to the girl. David was more formal. He talked about the boring principles of skiing, mainly to let Shishi understand the reasons and precautions of skiing. For example, when skiing, one should use the side blade of the skis to block the snow and exert force. For example, when should the center of gravity be forward? When should it be back, and why? For example, why did he have to use the internal brakes? Perhaps it was because he was wearing ski goggles. David didn't see Shishi looking at him blankly. What Yang Yi taught was much more practical. He taught Shishi some self-protection techniques. What if you fall like Lu Weisha? Yang Yi gently asked as he held on to Shishi's shoulders. Fell. Shishi looked at her father in surprise. The little girl had never thought about the possibility of falling while skiing, and her father's explanation made the little girl unprepared for the cruel reality. Even skiing can cause you to fall. Just like when you first learned to swim, you would choke on water. Yang Yi smiled and said to his daughter, It's normal to fall. Everyone learns to ski by falling. You can ask Lu Weisha if she fell when she learned to ski. Lu Weisha was at the side. After hearing this, she said honestly, Yes, I fell down many times and it was very painful. I even sprained my ankle, and I can't walk anymore. Shishi opened her mouth and looked at Lu Weisha for a while, and then looked at her father for help. The little girl grabbed the ski pole and couldn't help but touch her little butt. She muttered, But Papa, I'm afraid of pain. She fell so many times down the mountain, but she didn't cry out in pain. It was probably Lu Weisha's honest words that made Shishi nervous. It won't hurt, it won't hurt. Yang Yi smiled and comforted her. Look, Papa put on so many protective gear for you today, and there's one on your butt. Also, you have to learn from Papa. If you fall, lean back and sit on the left side. That way it won't hurt. Yang Yi taught Shishi some injury prevention techniques based on his skiing experience. Coupled with his personal lying down demonstration, Shishi quickly understood. It turned out that when one was about to fall, they would encounter such a situation. If they pushed sideways, they would be less affected by the fall. Papa will help you look after it, don't be afraid. Yang Yi comforted her. She also wanted to learn from Lu Weisha and ski elegantly and beautifully like her, and not be left behind by her friends. Shishi mustered her courage and stood up shakily with the ski pole in her hand. Needless to say, at the beginning, Shishi was also dizzy from the fall. If it weren't for the protective gear and Yang Yi's company, the little girl would have felt so wrong that she didn't want to play anymore. Shishi, you have to do this, Lu Weisha suggested enthusiastically. With her companions urging each other, the dizzy Sisi still got up again and headed down the snowy slope. Tong Tong and his mother were sitting at the rest pavilion watching their sisters ski. When Tong Tong saw his sister fall, he didn't think much of it at first. He even waved his chubby little hands and wanted to cheer for his sister happily. But he was soon shocked by his mother's constant worried shouts. Little Mommy looked at his mother in confusion, and only then did he realize that something was wrong. Aya, why do you keep falling? It's so dangerous. Aya, did you sprain your ankle? Mo Fei was worried sick. After all, Sisi was also a piece of flesh that fell from her body. This was the first time that Tong Tong used this way of thinking. He tilted his head and looked at his mother for a while, then looked at his sister. It must hurt a lot when you fall, right? The little mosquito blinked its eyes in sympathy and secretly touched its own little butt. However, due to its thick clothes, the little mosquito was so clumsy that it couldn't even touch its own butt, so it could only pretend that it didn't care. Although Shishi kept falling, her posture became more and more accurate. Even when her father was holding her hand, she still managed to ski for some distance. She has a good sense of balance. This makes it easier for her to fall. David brought Lu Weisha back and praised, she's learning very fast. Give her a few days and she might be better than Lu Weisha. Lu Weisha didn't care. After hearing her father's honest evaluation, she couldn't wait to report to Shishi. She even said to Shishi expectantly, Shishi, you can do it. Hurry up and learn. Then we can ski together. Although the snow was soft, Shishi was still a little dizzy from the fall. The little girl forced a smile at her friends and continued to ski with her father. If Shishi was here to learn how to fall, she definitely wouldn't like skiing. However, the little girl still wanted to be cool like her friends. Therefore, with her father's encouragement, the little girl was full of energy. Shishi was very focused when it came to learning. She was also very tenacious and talented in skiing. However, skiing was not easy at all. Many people were still beginners after years of learning. How could the little girl learn how to ski in just a few hours? Chapter 1259. While Yang Yi was teaching Shishi how to ski, he was still thinking about Murphy, who was taking care of Tong Tong. Today, his wife was also looking forward to skiing with them. However, in order to appease Tong Tong, Murphy sacrificed her own happiness. Yang Yi was not a daughter-con who would forget his wife after having a daughter. Murphy was still very important to him. He wanted to create a program that the whole family could participate in. Yang Yi looked at the snowmobiles parked at the foot of the mountain. However, he still had to teach Shishi how to ski. The little girl was still in the state of wrestling, so Yang Yi was not at ease. He was also fully equipped. He watched from the side slowly, and gave a few pointers from time to time. Ski in an S shape. Don't rush down directly. Shishi, look over here. My hands should be slippery like this. Hey, be careful. Seeing that Shishi had fallen, Yang Yi quickly propped himself up and chased after her. He pulled up the little girl, who had flipped sideways on the snowy ground, causing a large amount of snow to fall. Are you okay? Are you hurt from the fall? Yang Yi originally thought that he could be very hard-hearted and let Shishi fall a few more times. However, he could not help it and rushed over anxiously every time. Shishi also learned from her father's perseverance. After her father pulled her up, she patted the snow off her body, took 2 deep breaths, and shook her little head. However, Yang Yi was still not at ease. He took off his gloves and touched Shishi's ankles and knees with his bare hands in the -10 degrees Celsius cold wind. Basically, he could not feel anything with a few layers of clothes between them. However, Yang Yi was still very focused. Using his keen senses, he was able to sketch out Shishi's bone structure in his mind. She's fine. Yang Yi heaved a sigh of relief. When he looked up, Yang Yi saw Shishi looking down at him. Although she was wearing ski goggles, Yang Yi could still see the little girl's big, bright eyes. Papa gloves. The little girl snuggled into her father's arms through the protective gear. Her gloved little hand gently rested on her father's shoulder. She pointed at her father's exposed hand and mumbled, "Oh." Yang Yi smiled and obediently put on the gloves so that Shishi wouldn't worry. But at this moment, Murphy's cries and laughter suddenly came from the sky. "Look up." Mo Fei still said it in Chinese and English respectively. This way, Yang Yi would not miss it no matter what. Yang Yi raised his head in surprise. He didn't know when the cable car of the ski resort had started moving. On the other hand, Murphy, Maria, and Kitty were sitting on one of the hanging chairs as they slowly passed by. Tong Tong wasn't afraid of heights at all. On the contrary, the little guy thought that it was quite fun to play like this. He cried out happily from the top. His eyes were looking forward. He was excited about the top of the slope and the snowy peaks that were even further away. However, he ignored his mother's shouts and seemed to have forgotten about his sisters who were struggling below. Yang Yi and Murphy's eyes met. He smiled and gave Murphy a thumbs up. He was still thinking about when to accompany Murphy. He didn't expect Murphy and Maria to come up with a way to entertain themselves. This time, Shishi reluctantly slid over. When she was about to fall, she actually leaned forward and backward to balance herself. Great! Very great! Yang Yi slid over to Shishi's side and praised her with a smile. Shishi, this is the first time you didn't fall. Shishi wasn't really a beginner. After all, her technique wasn't standard. She didn't fall this time, but it didn't mean that she wouldn't fall the next time. However, her father's praise still made Shishi feel a great sense of accomplishment. The little girl raised her head and smiled shyly at her father. She even shook her little butt shyly. It was probably because her clothes were too thick and not because Shishi hurt her butt. The little girl didn't shake her butt too much and it wasn't very obvious. Yang Yi didn't rush to point out Shishi's problem when she slid just now. He first patted Shishi's shoulder and smiled as he pointed to the cable car that her mother and brother had left. He then told her what had happened just now. Wow. Shishi sighed as she looked enviously at the cable cars passing by. Do you want to take a break? Daddy will take you to ride the cable car. Yang Yi gently patted Shishi's shoulder and asked with a smile. You must be very tired from skiing. Next time, we'll go to the north. This is Xian Air's grandmother's house. You can learn to ski there. Oh, Cece shook her head, unwilling to comply. You still want to ski? Didn't your butt hurt? Yang Yi was slightly surprised and asked half-jokingly. Shishi nodded her little head. She pointed to Lu Weisha, who was not far away and could ski higher. She pouted slightly and said, I want to ski. The little girl wanted to ski like her friends. Moreover, she was still in high spirits and wanted to ski better. Yang Yi naturally wouldn't discourage Shishi's enthusiasm. He snapped his fingers and said with a smile, Okay, then let's continue to learn to ski. Although Yang Yi still didn't believe that Shishi could learn to ski in one day, this didn't prevent his heart from being filled with joy. She is indeed the daughter that Yang Yi have taught. At noon, they had a simple meal at the restaurant in the ski resort and took a break. However, Yang Yi and David, two men who hadn't had enough fun skiing in the morning, decided to have a competition with each other. This competition was proposed by David. When Yang Yi was teaching Shishi how to ski, he secretly observed them and felt that Yang Yi's skiing skills were very good. Yang Yi was also a little itchy, so the two hit it off. They carried their equipment and excitedly got on the cable car to the top of the mountain. Murphy and Maria looked at each other and smiled. Maria suggested, Who wants to watch your father ski together? I want. Shishi and Lu Weisha jumped up excitedly. Tong Tong followed behind his sisters. He didn't know what they were talking about, but he also jumped up happily. The group of people came to a rest stop in the middle of the ski slope and looked at the two small black dots that had just come down from the cable car. There weren't many people in the ski resort today. Perhaps it was because the winter vacation of the Swedish children was coming to an end, so there were no more than 10 people skiing. At this moment, the other guests were leisurely eating lunch, so Murphy and the others easily recognized Yang Yi and the others. Suddenly, they saw the two small black dots start to slide down. They were both sliding down in an S shape, as if the small black dots were drawing arcs on the clean snow. However, there was still a difference in speed. Not long after, the small black dot on the left took the lead and widened the distance between it and the small black dot on the right at an extremely fast speed. "Which one is Papa?" Murphy couldn't help but mutter. Murphy said it in Chinese very softly, so only Shishi and Tong Tong could hear it. "The fastest is Papa," Shishi said confidently. "Papa is super awesome. Papa is good at knocking." Tong Tong also nodded affirmatively, not knowing if he understood. Chapter 1260. As mentioned before, the slope of this ski resort wasn't too high, so they didn't have to wait too long. In the time it took Murphy and the children to talk, they soon saw the appearance of the little black dot at the front of the ski resort. That equipment and appearance. It was Yang Yi. The result of the PK was out, but no one cared about it. What everyone admired was Yang Yi's thrilling skiing speed. He was already in a state of rapid skiing, but he could still make a sharp turn. The closer they got, the more obvious this feeling was. Maria was experienced and knowledgeable, but she couldn't help but marvel. Murphy was still a little confused, because she had never skied before, so she couldn't make a correct judgment. She could only look at Maria and couldn't help but worry. When Yang Yi reached the end of the first section of the slope at high speed, Murphy could see more clearly. She found that Yang Yi actually flew up and turned 360 degrees in the air, crossing more than half of the buffer zone. Then, Yang Yi used the inertia to slide over and continued to slide down. But at the moment when Yang Yi flew up, Murphy's heart was mixed with several emotions. On one hand, Murphy still felt that Yang Yi's performance at the moment was very cool. After all, Yang Yi was skilled and daring, and he made a very beautiful turn. In between the rise and fall, it was as if he went from moving to still, as if he was gliding on flat ground, and it didn't cause much snow to fall. On the other hand, Murphy was also worried for Yang Yi, and she blamed Yang Yi in her heart. "Why are you acting cool? What if you break your leg?" Murphy was so nervous that she ignored Shishi, who was beside her, who was very excited. The little girl was fascinated by the scene, and after confirming that it was her father, she jumped on the spot happily. Now that she saw her father's great performance, the little girl felt even more proud. "Shishi, your father is so cool." Lu Weisha couldn't help but turn her head and say to Shishi with envy. When Yang Yi reached the last section of the slope, he had already slowed down, but his figure was still very cool. He made a big arc and finally slid in front of Murphy, Maria, and the children. "Papa!" Shishi couldn't hold back. She waited for her father to stop, and then she cried out happily. She quickly broke away from her mother's hand that was holding her arm, and ran happily to her father. "Come, Shishi." Yang Yi smiled and raised his arm, and gestured to Shishi. The little girl understood almost instantly. With a slightly hoarse laugh, she giggled and ran in front of her father. She raised her hand high, jumped lightly, and clapped with her father. "Papa, you're number one." After the little girl finished clapping with her father, she stood on her tiptoes and said to her father with a little pride, "There's no number one. Uncle David and I both have our own strengths, so this is just a small exhibition game. We'll show you how fathers ski." Yang Yi quickly corrected her. Of course, Yang Yi himself also felt that he deserved to be number one. David was only now slowly sliding to their side. However, it was still better to be humble when teaching children. They shouldn't compete too much. Therefore, even though David didn't mind praising Yang Yi responded calmly and didn't show any arrogance at all. He had to set a good example for the children. The sun in the afternoon was very short, and it was expected that the sun would set at around 3 o'clock. Although they could still burn the midnight oil, after dark, The temperature in Kiruna dropped quickly when it was night time. Yang-yi could endure it, but Murphy and the children couldn't stand such cold weather. Therefore, they planned to leave for the hotel when the sun went down. Therefore, when Yang-yi and David came back, they would take the little girls to practice skiing again. At first, Murphy was very interested in learning how to ski. However, after seeing Shishi fall so many times, and how she kept falling on the same spot after putting on the skateboard, she simply couldn't show Shishi's good sense of balance. After falling twice, she decided to give up and let Yang-yi continue to teach Shishi. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun began to set in the west. Yang-yi temporarily entrusted Shishi to David and Lu Weisha so that they could continue to teach Shishi how to ski. He went down the mountain again and rented a snowmobile. He drove directly to the front of the lounge and pulled Murphy and Tong Tong onto the snowmobile. Mommy will sit at the back and Huawei will sit in the middle. Both of you have to hug my waist. Yang-yi arranged. Murphy had been looking forward to this moment for a long time. She pressed tightly on Yang-yi's hip and lowered her head to coax Tong Tong, who was too excited to take an afternoon nap. We're going to ride the car. Car. Tong Tong hugged his father's broad waist and smiled contentedly as he was sandwiched between his parents. However, he was more excited about the type of car than what he was going to do next. What kind of car is this? The little boy muttered to himself. Motorcycle. Ambulance. Fire truck? It was as if there was only the existence of a fire truck in his mind. Yang-yi and Murphy didn't hear the little boy's muttering clearly, because the snowmobile had already started moving. The sound of the snowmobile drowned out Tong Tong's question and answer. It didn't matter. The most important thing was the experience of riding the snowmobile. Tong Tong, who was protected in the middle by his parents, didn't feel much difference. He only felt that the scenery around him seemed to be moving backwards as the snowmobile started moving. It was the same feeling as when his father drove the car. Hee. The little boy thought it was fun. He looked around excitedly and couldn't stop for even a moment. In comparison, Murphy was not as courageous as Tong Tong. When Yang-yi was halfway up the mountain and was about to dive down, Murphy looked at the snowy scenery below and couldn't help but grab onto Yang-yi's clothes and scream. Slow down. Don't go too fast. Murphy shouted nervously. She was still a little embarrassed and found an excuse. Don't hit the children below. Yang-yi didn't stubbornly dive down at full speed. After all, he wanted to bring Murphy to experience riding a snowmobile. He didn't want to enjoy the thrill of speed himself. He drove down slowly and didn't continue climbing. Instead, he drove Murphy and Tong Tong around the gentle slope of the ski resort. Yay! Murphy was very satisfied and cheered loudly from behind. Yang-yi drove a few rounds with Murphy and Tong Tong. When the sun was about to set, Yang-yi returned the snowmobile and went to pick up Shishi to check on her skiing results. Of course, Yang-yi also wanted to call Shishi along. They were ready to go back. However, the scene in front of him left Yang-yi dumbfounded. Shishi was already skiing side by side with Lu Weisha. Moreover, Shishi's performance seemed to have improved a little, which Yang-yi didn't expect. How did she learn how to ski? Of course, Shishi was still a little slow and her movements were a little nervous. However, the little girl was indeed skiing with her friends. Moreover, she didn't look like she was going to fall. She's so good? Yang-yi was pleasantly surprised. On one hand, he was happy for Shishi. After all, learning how to ski in a day was almost impossible in the eyes of ordinary people. However, Shishi still managed to learn. At least for this round, the little girl's movements seemed to be quite good. On the other hand, Yang-yi couldn't help but feel a little sour in his heart. How did his daughter learn how to ski under other people's guidance? Dad hasn't even seen her learn how to ski. Chapter 1261. It was dark, and everyone who returned to the hotel had a happy smile on their faces. Especially Shishi, who had learned how to ski beginner. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, happily holding her father's camera. She brought her little brother to look at the photos that Auntie Maria had taken. Shishi didn't care that her little brother was right beside her. She giggled and called out to her little brother, This one is super good." Tong Tong was quite supportive. His rosy little mouth was slightly open, and his two little hands were grabbing onto his sister's arms. He tried his best to stick his head into his sister's arms to take a look. When he saw his sister's heroic posture, while skiing, he happily raised his two little arms high up in the air. Tong Tong squinted his eyes and laughed heartily with his sister. She was finally satisfied and turned to the next photo. However, the legendary handsome didn't last for more than 3 seconds. She quickly turned to the photo of herself falling in the snow. Her little face instantly turned red. "Oh, I can't look at this." She shyly covered the camera and hid it on the left side of her body. Don't ask she why she didn't just skip the photo and move on to the next one. She didn't think that far ahead. However, the more she hid it, the more curious Tong Tong became. He had only caught a glimpse of it and didn't see anything clearly. Thus, Tong Tong couldn't take it anymore. He anxiously pulled on his sister's arm and pouted his little mouth. "Woo-woo. I want to see it, I want to see it." "You can't see it," she shouted. "You can see it." Tong Tong pulled on his sister's arm and adeptly looked at his sister with his big round eyes as he muttered. Shi's principles weren't very strong at the moment, and she was quickly defeated by her little brother. She reluctantly took the camera back and showed it to Tong Tong while she pouted her little mouth and said, "You can look at it, but you can't laugh at me. Do you understand?" Tong Tong tugged on his sister's arm to bring the camera closer. He saw his sister's new heroic posture. Falling down can also be very handsome if Thomas turns around to look at her. Then, the little guy looked up and giggled at his sister. "Aya, you're really making fun of me. I'm not showing it to you." She angrily grabbed the camera and turned it to the side. However, the little girl didn't have such a bad temper. After a few seconds, she saw the photos of the fathers skiing taken by Aunt Maria. She forgot about the unhappiness just now and happily held the camera for her brother to see. "Little brother, look, Papa is really good at skiing." Tong Tong snuggled up to her sister and watched intently. She nodded her little head repeatedly and imitated her sister. "Yes, Papa is awesome." However, she and Tong Tong didn't know that at this time, their super awesome Papa was playing with water with Mom in the bathroom. It was worth mentioning that the hotel in Kiruna that they stayed in for the past 2 days was not like the ice-themed hotel that they booked tomorrow. It was completely made of ice and had a lot of personality. However, the luxurious feeling of this hotel was not bad at all. Not to mention the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of the mountains in the distance. The most praiseworthy thing was that there was a big pool in the bathroom of each room. The pool was filled with hot spring water that was steaming hot. After playing for the whole day, it was really comfortable to soak in the hot spring for once. Yesterday, Yang-yi and Murphy took the children to soak in the hot spring once. Today, Shi and Tong Tong took the opportunity to look at the photos on the big bed outside. Especially Tong Tong, with his sister helping to take care of him. Yang-yi dragged the red-faced Murphy into the bathroom. A new environment, a new position, and a new angle. The process and taste were indescribable. Anyway, when they came out, Murphy's face was flushed red. Her skin seemed to have softened after soaking in the hot spring water, and relaxed due to the steam. It also seemed to be covered with a layer of attractive luster. Behind her, Yang-yi looked refreshed. However, his actions were a little strange. He sneaked up to the trash can and threw a bag of things into it. Then, he laughed to cover up his laughter, and pounced on the 2 children who were screaming on the bed. "Hurry up and tidy up. We still have to meet up with Lu Weisha and her family later for dinner." Yang-yi laughed and said as he patted the 2 children's buttocks. Although they returned to the hotel and did everything, in reality, it was only 6 o'clock in the evening. It was not even 3 o'clock yet, so Kiruna still had its own unique characteristics. Although the children were very excited during the day, in the process, they also exhausted a lot of their energy. In addition, they didn't sleep at noon. Before 8 o'clock in the evening, Shi and Tong Tong couldn't resist the sleepiness. They crawled into the warm blankets and fell asleep. Yang-yi, on the other hand, had a harder time. He let Murphy lie on the bed with her limbs spread out. Then he climbed up and gave Murphy a massage. "You've worked hard today. You climbed up and down and fell many times. If I don't give you a massage and massage your muscles, Your whole body will be sore tomorrow, and you won't be able to walk. Yang Yi smiled and said gently as he massaged the muscles on Murphy's arms and stretched her tendons. Murphy had already experienced Yang Yi's massage skills countless times. Naturally, she didn't refute. She buried her head comfortably between the two pillows and snorted comfortably like a little pig. After an unknown amount of time, Murphy was in a daze and was about to fall asleep amidst the waves of pain and comfort. However, Yang Yi's surprised voice suddenly rang in her ears. Honey, honey, wake up. Wake up and see the aurora. Murphy was indeed a little tired. Her original physical fitness was relatively poor, but in the past few years, following Yang Yi, she exercised every 2 to 3 days and led a regular and healthy life. That was why she was able to persist in trekking through mountains and rivers for a few days. However, even so, her physical fitness was far inferior to Yang Yi's. Now she was in a half-awake state and in a daze, she couldn't get up. Yang Yi smiled and simply carried Murphy by her waist as if he was snatching a civilian girl. He carried her to the floor-to-ceiling window. With this jolt, Murphy finally woke up. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry as she patted Yang Yi's shoulder. Only then did she sit down on the sofa and look at the distant sky in surprise. The dark sky had been lit up, as if 2 long flames were dancing in the air. The silver-blue color was ever-changing. The flames extended outwards in curved folds, but the vertical angle had an illusory feeling like a curtain. It was like a 3D pattern, dazzling and fascinating. Wow! Murphy finally let go of the arms around Yang Yi's neck and cried out in surprise. It's really the aurora. I've seen it on TV before. Yang Yi smiled and said, Of course it's real. I'll go and wake up the children. I was thinking of going to the Ice Snow Hotel tomorrow to wait for the aurora. I didn't expect to meet it so coincidentally today. Chapter 1262. It wasn't easy to wake up a child who was sleeping soundly. Not to mention little Wan Wan. When Cece was shaken awake by her father from the bed and pulled up by her little arm to sit up, she felt inexplicably wronged in her heart. Woo 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 woo. The little girl rubbed her eyes with her 2 small hands as she sat on the bed and cried sadly. Her voice was very soft, and it felt as if she was half asleep. Yang Yi looked at the little girl who was crying so hard that her hair and cheeks were wet. He found it funny, but he also felt sorry for her. He smiled and asked, Why are you crying? Get up and look at the aurora. Then, Yang Yi heard his daughter mumble in between sobs. What did you say? Yang Yi curiously moved his head closer to Shishi's mouth. I want Papa. Cece lowered her little head, and her bangs covered her eyes and her little hands. She sniffed softly and said in a daze, What? You want Daddy? Yang Yi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He reached out to rub the little girl's head and said, Isn't Daddy right in front of you? Why do you want Daddy? Yang Yi didn't coax Shishi for the time being. He turned around and woke Tong Tong up. Tong Tong was even harder to wake up. When he woke up, he cried even more sadly than his sister. He felt as if his beloved robot had been snatched away from him. Fortunately, when Tong Tong woke up and started crying, Shishi gradually woke up. She was still a little confused, so she sat on the bed and stared blankly at her little brother who was crying and rolling around, kicking his little chubby legs. Yang Yi left Tong Tong to Murphy. He went to the bathroom, wrung out a warm towel, and came over to wipe Shishi's face, who was still in a daze. After wiping away the tears on her face and the sweat stains caused by the heater, the little girl became bright and beautiful again. Especially her pair of black and bright eyes, which were still a little misty and watery, made people very happy. Shishi raised her little head and looked at her father. Then she pointed at Tong Tong, blinked innocently, and said to her father, Daddy, little brother is crying. Yang Yi smiled and pinched her little nose. He said with a smile, You still have the nerve to call him little brother. Weren't you crying just now? Shishi suddenly felt embarrassed. She cried and buried her head into her father's arms. It had to be said that even though Shishi was a little more awake after wiping her face, she still didn't have enough sleep. Therefore, the little girl nestled in her father's arms and couldn't help but yawn lazily. Her eyelids slightly drooped. She looked like an emperor in the morning court. If the ministers didn't have anything important to report, she would definitely doze off and fall asleep again. Yang called out to Murphy, then pulled Shishi up and said with a smile, "Let's go and see the aurora." The little girl's head was sleepy, and her thinking speed had decreased a lot. She took 2 steps forward and asked in a daze, "Aurora?" However, all the grievances, sleepiness and confusion before, after seeing the colorful aurora, all of it seemed to be worth it. Wow! Shishi's head was finally awake. She nestled in her father's arms and looked at the changing sky outside the floor-to-ceiling window in surprise. Her rosy little mouth couldn't help but open as she gasped in admiration. Not only Shishi, but Tong Tong, who had cried the hardest, also had red eyes. He sniffled and looked at the sky in a daze. Tong Tong's little brain was still very simple. He couldn't understand what kind of natural phenomenon this was. He was even in a daze and didn't know what he was doing. His big watery eyes reflected the changing lights, but there were only a few question marks left in them. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing? In contrast, Shishi was much more knowledgeable. When she was at home, she learned about the aurora from Lu Weisha. Then, Yang Yi took her to watch some science videos about the aurora. But sometimes, knowledge didn't have a chance to show up in front of the magnificent natural scenery. Shishi looked at the changing colors in the sky, and even the aurora was mixed with some red hues. Her eyes were blurred, and she was so shocked by the beautiful scenery that she couldn't speak. It wasn't until Lu Weisha was woken up by her parents, Yang Yi had called David's family earlier, that she rushed over. With the company of her friends, Shishi finally recovered from her daze. She excitedly huddled with her friends and chatted with them. "Shishi, look, I didn't lie to you. The aurora is really beautiful," Lu Weisha said with a smile. Yes, Lu Weisha, your hometown is really amazing. The sun sets early, but there are still such beautiful auroras," Shishi said. "There are a lot of auroras and I've seen a lot of them," Lu Weisha said. "But you've only been here for a few days. I'm so afraid that you won't be able to see the aurora. That would be such a pity." "But I can see it," Shishi said happily. "Hee, that's great." The 2 girls chatted happily, and at the same time, they enjoyed the changing aurora in the sky. Perhaps it wasn't just good luck. It was also a very happy thing to be able to enjoy the beautiful scenery with her friends. The aurora lasted for nearly an hour. When it ended, Tong Tong had already fallen asleep in her mother's arms. Shishi and Lu Weisha were also very sleepy. The 2 girls kept fighting to keep their eyelids open, but with each other's company and talking, they managed to get through it. Of course, after the aurora ended, Lu Weisha went back to her room with her parents, and Shishi naturally went back to bed to sleep. Yang Yi covered the 2 children with a quilt, and then came over to the sofa. Looking at Murphy, who was lazily nestled on the sofa, he laughed. "Aren't you going to sleep? Are you going to stay here and wait for the second aurora?" "It's rare for it to happen twice in a day. I'm not looking at the aurora. I think the sky is very beautiful right now. It's full of stars without any light pollution, and we can see the Milky Way," Murphy said emotionally as she raised her hand, as if she was looking at the sky through the gaps between her fingers. Yang Yi looked around and gestured with his fingers. He smiled and said, "Why don't I move all the sofas over and put them together? This way, we can sleep on the sofa and look at the starry sky all night. It's quite romantic when you put it that way." "Okay." Murphy happily jumped down from the sofa and rolled up the sleeves of Yang Yi's oversized shirt. She looked like she wanted to help Yang Yi move the sofa. Stop. You have thin arms and legs. Don't do this kind of heavy work." Yang Yi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The sofas in the hotel were very wide, very big, very long and very thick. If the sofas were put together, they would form a big bed. Yang Yi even took the pillows, quilts and blankets from the other bed. Murphy happily helped to lay out the blankets. She stepped on it and pulled Yang Yi over to let him sleep first before she snuggled into the blanket. She hugged his arm and comfortably let out a long hum. "Actually, this hotel isn't the best place to look at the aurora and the starry sky. I saw on the internet that in Finland, there's a hotel with a glass dome that imitates the Eskimos' igloos. The entire sky can be seen through the glass dome. Young-yi described to Murphy and smiled. It's a pity that we're in Sweden and can't go to Finland. Otherwise, we can go and experience that hotel together. It must be very special. Murphy rubbed her head on Young-yi's chest and chuckled. With her lazy and charming voice, she said, I don't care about the igloos or the glass dome. As long as you're by my side, I'll be happy no matter where I go. Young-yi couldn't help but laugh. He wanted to say a few more teasing words, but he was so touched that he couldn't say anything. He could only reach out and put his arms around Emofei's neck, lowered his head, and gave her a lingering, gentle kiss. Chapter 1263. With the company of David and his family and the tour guide, many small things were arranged properly. Young-yi and the others were less worried. The next morning after breakfast, Young-yi and the others checked out of the original hotel when the sky was still dark. They sat in a small van rented by David and headed to the legendary ice hotel. After all, the city was sealed by ice and snow. The entire city was covered in thick white snow. The tires of the small van were almost stuck in the snow. As they moved forward, they made a deep roaring sound. It felt like they were going to collapse at any time. However, although the small van was driving shakily, as if it was cross-country in a rugged mountain, which made it very uncomfortable to sit in, for the children, this kind of shaky car was more interesting. Along the way, whether it was Shishi Lu Weisha or Tong Tong, who was in her mother's arms, they were all giggling nonstop. The ice hotel was located in a small town 20 kilometers away from the city. Although it took about an hour to drive there in the snow, and the time was a little long, it passed very quickly amidst the laughter and laughter. When they came back to their senses, they had already arrived at their destination. The ice hotel's appearance was not very good. It was like a small raised snow slope, but it was really made of ice. After entering, one would find a completely different world. Like the hotel's bar, the bar counter was made of ice, and there were some patterns carved on it. However, the most beautiful thing was the translucent ice that was illuminated by the light. There were some crystal textures inside, and it was completely natural. Every piece looked different. When the light reflected, the blue light made the entire hall look cold and elegant. Staying in such a hotel was not cheap at all. However, there were still many tourists who came. They stayed in the hotel in the city, and then bought a tour ticket to see the entire ice sculpture landscape of the hotel. Of course, Young-yi and the others did not care about this little bit of money. Young-yi was only concerned about the comfort of the two most luxurious suites that they booked. After all, they had children. If it was like the row of ice beds that they had visited at the beginning, it would be meaningless. Fortunately, after the hotel staff opened the door for them, Young-yi saw that the interior of their suite was not bad. It was similar to what was described on the internet. The facilities were definitely not as good as the hotel they stayed in last night. There was no TV, computer, or other electrical appliances. There was only a slightly larger ice bed that could accommodate Young-yi's family of 4. There was also an ice table and 4 ice chairs at the side. Other than that, there were also some ice sculptures on the walls. Compared to the ones outside, there were more of them and they were more exquisite. Coupled with the colorful lights, the colors of the entire room became lively. Are there no windows here? Murphy asked curiously. There are no windows because it's very cold outside. An enclosed environment is more suitable for keeping the interior warm. The waiter understood English and replied in English. Murphy felt that she had asked a rather stupid question, so she shrunk her head back in embarrassment. She moved closer to Young-yi and whispered to Young-yi, I didn't want to open the window, but I was wondering if the room would be too stuffy without a window. Young-yi smiled and took her to see an external ventilation device in the room. Although there were no windows, the 2 suites they lived in had an advantage. That was, they had a separate bathroom. They could not take a bath and could only go to the toilet. But even so, compared to the simple rooms outside, it was still much better. There was no heating in the room. After all, they were living in an igloo. If the heating was turned on, the room would probably collapse. Murphy looked at the thick animal fur blanket on the bed, and was a little worried that it would be too cold to sleep at night. However, they would not stay in the hotel immediately. After putting down their luggage, Yang Yi's family and David's family once again got into the minivan and staggered to Lake Rosa. However, before arriving at their destination, they first came to a small town on the outskirts of Lake Rosa. David went over to ask, and soon, they rented enough sleigh car teams. Yes, they wanted to experience dog sledding, but generally, 6 dogs pulled a sleigh that could seat 2 people. Now, in order to meet the needs of Yang Yi and his family, they changed to a larger sleigh that could seat 4 people with 12 dogs pulling it. And counting Lu Weisha's family, they needed at least 24 dogs. Including the tour guide and the others, almost all the sledding dogs in the small town had been bought. Of course, the old Swedish man who ran the dog sledding program was still very happy. He counted the money while exhaling white cold air and laughing nonstop. After knowing that they were going to take a sleigh, she asked her father curiously, "Papa, are we pulling the sleigh?" Yang Yi was stunned for a moment. He remembered the scene of going down the mountain after watching the sunrise yesterday. He smiled and patted Shishi on the shoulder and said, "No, we are going to take a sleigh pulled by a puppy, we are all." Before Yang Yi finished speaking, the noisy barking of dogs outside had reached their ears. Rushing out of the cabin, Yang Yi took the eager little guys and saw a large group of dogs outside. To be exact, it was a large group of huskies. That's right. The black and white, or a little gray hair, the black eyes and small pupils, the silly appearance. Yang Yi recognized their identity at first glance. Huskies. Why is it a husky? Murphy looked at Yang Yi in surprise and asked in a low voice. She was embarrassed to show her ignorance in front of others, so she only dared to ask Yang Yi secretly. Of course, Yang Yi knew this kind of dog very well. He smiled and said to Murphy, "They are huskies. They have another name, Siberian sled dogs. They were first used to pull sleighs because they are cold-resistant, eat little, and are very serious when pulling sleighs. In the past, hunters would pull sleighs with them to the deep forest to hunt." Murphy looked at Yang Yi in surprise, and then looked at the huskies who were staring at them before they started. She couldn't think of the so-called serious work in these legendary huskies. Are these dogs? She had already started discussing with Lu Weisha. Yes, they are very powerful. They can pull us and run, just like horses. Lu Weisha said. Lu Weisha, don't you think they are like wolves? She asked Lu Weisha, both happy and worried. It's okay, they are not wolves, they are dogs. Lu Weisha laughed. She looked at the huskies who were wagging their tails in a friendly manner and shaking their heads to rub against their companions. Her fear disappeared and was replaced by curiosity and joy. "Papa, can I touch these dogs? They are so cute." She said to her father enviously. "That's not okay." Yang Yi shook his head and patiently explained, "Because they are different from Steamed Bun. When Steamed Bun is at home, we often give him a bath, but these dogs have never been bathed, and then they have to work, so they will smell very bad." Indeed, although the cold made it difficult for the nose to breathe, Yang Yi could still vaguely smell the stench from these dogs. After all, they lived in a dog pen, not a pet dog that lived with humans. But after listening to her father's words, she felt even more sorry for these big dogs. Chapter 1264. Watching the bearded grandpa Swede fastening the sleigh rope on the huskies, Cece couldn't help but frown her snow-stained eyebrows. "Papa, Papa." The little girl turned around and gently tugged at her father's clothes with her 2 gloved hands. "Shishi, what's wrong?" Yang Yi squatted down. The little girl's eyes were still very bright, as if there were stars twinkling in the dark night. However, her eyebrows drooped slightly and she said worriedly, "Papa, why do these dogs have to pull these sleds?" Yang Yi froze for a moment, and found that this question was a bit difficult to answer. He pondered for a moment and said, "Because this is their job." But they are very pitiful. They are so small, and then they have to pull heavy things." She hugged her father's shoulder and said a little sadly, "Papa, can we not let these dogs pull us? We can take a car." Yang Yi smiled and patted the little girl's back gently. He said, "Are you worried that they will be tired?" She nodded with a serious expression. "But these dogs are different from other dogs. They like nature and the feeling of pulling sleds. When they were young, they started pulling sleds and running. They won't be tired just because they pull us, Yang Yi explained. These words were actually a bit untrue. Yang Yi also knew that the huskies didn't just want to pull sleds. He also knew that humans tamed them for their own convenience. However, Yang Yi also couldn't be sure if letting these huskies pull sleds was a kind of torture for them, or just a game for them to stroll and run wildly. It was like throwing frisbees to dogs. It seemed a bit inhumane to let them run around and pick up things, but dogs liked it. They wanted humans to play with them every day. Really? Shishi asked doubtfully. Yes, you see, how happy they are now. They are jumping around and can't wait to pull us and run in the snow. Yang Yi smiled and said, And Shishi, do you know? In our city, there are also some people who raise them, just like how we raise steamed buns. Shishi was a little fascinated. But these dogs are very energetic. They need humans to take them out to play, and let them run to their heart's content. If they stay at home for too long, they will feel very uncomfortable. They will bite the furniture at home and do some silly things. Yang Yi said softly, so compared to them, these dogs who can run in the snow they are familiar with every day are still very happy. Shishi was fooled by her father. She tilted her little head and muttered doubtfully, Is that so? When they first came to the town, the sun had just risen. When they got on the sleigh, the sky was already very bright. The bearded hunter took a dog and sat in an independent sleigh in front. He shouted, and suddenly, all the dogs became restless. When it was Yang Yi's turn to ride the sleigh, the 12 huskies couldn't wait to run. Such a large group of muscular dogs ran happily. Although the sleigh of Yang Yi's family of 4 was very heavy, it was still dragged. Moreover, because the resistance in the snow was reduced, the huskies dragged the sleigh along the path that was pressed out of the snow. It was not very difficult for them to run forward. Oh, Cece was a little worried about these dogs just now, but after they started running, the little girl finally felt the enthusiasm of these dogs. She leaned back, and if it weren't for her father holding her, she would probably have fallen on all fours. Hey Socks! Tong Tong, who had sharp eyes, suddenly shouted excitedly and struggled to stand up from her mother's arms. No. Tong Tong, you have to be obedient. Don't move. Yang Yi's left hand pressed on Shishi's little shoulder, and his right hand was also about to take care of Murphy, whose head was in his arms because of the cold wind. When the sleigh sat up and sped up, the wind in the wilderness became stronger. Naturally, the body felt the temperature even lower. Fortunately, before they came out today, under the advice of the experienced David, Yang Yi asked the children and Murphy to wear more clothes and enough windproof equipment, such as face scarves. However, the children were not afraid of the cold. They did not want to wear face scarves, so they simply tied scarves around their necks, and continued to shout energetically in this world of ice and snow. Shishi forgot her previous worries and happily waved at Lu Weisha, who was on the sleigh in front of them, and whispered, We're behind you. She knew that Lu Weisha wouldn't be able to hear her if the wind was so strong, but she still couldn't help but mutter. At this time, Shishi felt her hand being pulled. She turned her head and saw Tong Tong, who was tightly held in her mother's arms. The little girl was a little depressed when her father interrupted her statement. She looked at her sister anxiously. Sister, look, Socks, the dogs have socks. Tong Tong said intermittently to her sister in the wind. Socks. Shishi looked in the direction of Tong Tong's hand and showed a surprised expression. It's true. Cece was far away and didn't pay attention earlier. She thought that these dogs' feet were black, but now it seemed that they were all wearing a pair. No, it should be said that each dog was wearing 4 custom-made black cotton socks. The white elastic band at the top was very strong. It allowed the socks to be firmly worn on their feet, and protected the huskies' paws well. Also, to a certain extent, it increased the friction and made them run more cheerfully. Wow, brother, it's true. Shishi turned her head in surprise and said to Tong Tong, The dogs are really wearing socks. Tong Tong felt that she had received her sister's praise. She smiled contentedly and stayed in her mother's arms. The journey was relatively monotonous. There was only one accident, which was a small section of uphill road where the snow was thick and it was difficult to walk. However, The dogs were still very smart. They stopped, turned their heads obediently, stuck out their tongues, and wagged their tails to wait for people to help them. Of course, if these huskies did not roll their eyes to look at people, they would be even cuter. When they arrived at Lake Rosa, there was a very special tourist attraction, which was to experience the icebreaker. The decommissioned icebreaker was used as a sightseeing boat, and it carried Yang Yi and the others to experience the icebreaker journey. When they arrived at an isolated lake area, facing the calm lake water that had been specially cleared of ice, there was another novel experience waiting for Yang Yi and the others. Floating on the ice lake. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.